Very recently, I went on a hike to one of the many parks in my area. With me, I brought my cousin for some company and to have somebody to talk to. We're pretty close, always have been. I'm still not sure whether to really believe her or not, but this is what happened. We were hiking for about 2 hours, and we came across a pond. My cousin walked over to the edge by some trees and started talking quietly, so I couldn't understand what she was saying at first. I asked her, "What are you doing?" And I asked, walking up behind her. As soon as she turned around, she grabs my hand in hers, looks down at the ground in front of us, and pointed at me for me to look. All I saw were some animal tracks in the soft mud, but she insisted it was something else. She explained that the footprints were too big to be any normal animals. Whatever made these tracks had to have been at least 6 feet tall and abnormally large. I didn't believe her, of course, because she really gets into character when we watch scary movies or when she reads something before bed. I kind of rolled my eyes at her, laughing it off. We walked for another 15 minutes in silence before she finally broke it. "I'm not crazy, you know," she said seriously, with her eyes on the ground, like she was talking to herself more than me. Startled by what she had said, and forgetting the conversation we had 15 minutes previously, I turned around to face her in response. "Well, then prove it. What did you see?" I asked her. She looked up at me, and her eyes were welted, tears in her eyes. She just whispered, "I'm not lying." Then began to run faster than I could keep up with through the dense trees of the forest. A branch must have caught on her foot or something. She stopped running. She fell on the ground, and it looked like there were blood all over her shoes from where they got ripped off in the fall. I dropped my backpack next to hers, thinking she'd got hurt, helping my cousin get back on her feet. We sat down for a few moments to catch our breath before heading back home towards the park entrance closest to us. We weren't exactly sure what the blood was or where it came from. We just assumed that perhaps it was animal blood, so we wiped it off and went on our way. We sat down there for a few moments to catch our breath before heading back home towards the park entrance closest to us. When we finally made it out of that section of woods, we kept walking for a good mile or two before she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. It was a large dark figure standing on top of a hill. I could not make out what it was at first, but my cousin claims it was not human, whatever it was. She grabs my arm, pushes me behind some trees so we can hide without being seen. We watched as this thing walked down the hill towards us, stopping about 20 feet away from us to sniff the air. I swear, it must have been almost 10 feet tall. We crept even closer to the edge of the woods so that we would not have to worry about being heard or smelled by whatever that thing was. It took one single step into the clearing, then another, and just completely vanished out of sight. My cousin freaks out, told me to run home without her, but I made her come with me until we were nearly back at the entrance. We both heard a loud crashing sound from somewhere in the woods, sending shivers down our spine, thinking about it. I ran away, back toward the clearing where I'd last seen the thing before it disappeared. All I found was footprints, giant ones, just like my cousin said they would be, so much bigger than mine. The ground was practically torn up, huge claw marks. Whatever this thing was must have been really mad. There was blood splattered by some trees, and I could see a dead deer not too far away. It looked like whatever this thing was grabbed the deer by the back legs and threw it against a tree to smash its head in. This, I believe, was the blood we had found earlier. Next day, my mom actually called a park ranger to tell him about what happened. He didn't really seem to take her too seriously, but promised he would take notes and assure that our safety was of the utmost importance. Still one of the freakiest experiences I've ever had. Let me start by saying that I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. I was never bothered by it as much as most people, until I got older and experienced something that made me question everything. Back in 2012, I lived alone in a cabin on a reservation. This was only a few years ago now. Around 9:30, I lived alone, and I was getting ready for bed after a long day of work. As I laid down in bed, I felt the sensation of somebody watching me from the outside window. It was nothing but a natural reflex to raise my head up and look out my window to find nothing unusual. This didn't dissuade me from feeling safe and going back to bed, since I was used to watching for coyotes and other small animals that would come up to my window. As soon as my head hit the pillow, I heard what sounded like somebody walking around on the roof of my cabin. This made me uneasy. I knew nobody else lived in this area, and there were no wild animals that could possibly imitate those kind of noises, or be that heavy. I sat there in bed, frozen with fear, as the sounds of whoever or whatever it was were walking around on top of my roof. Closer, closer. Then, all of a sudden, after about 10 minutes of this walking around, it stopped, and I could not hear anything anymore. Just complete silence. Another 5 minutes passed by. I decided there was no way I was going to fall back asleep. So I got up, started reading on my phone. As I was halfway through my chapter on my book, I hear this scratching noise coming from the side of the house, which is right next to where my window is. It sounded like somebody was trying to pry parts of the boards off. I stood up, quickly looking outside. As quietly as possible, I crept over to the front door of the cabin, grabbing my steel baseball bat, ready to whack whoever it is, playing real-life whack-a-mole. I peeked outside but didn't see anything. As carefully as possible, I crept out, the door now fully open. Nothing but darkness. I put my shoes on and walked outside, searching for any sign of anything. My heart was the only thing that was audible. It was racing and beating so hard, I figured the whole neighborhood would hear it. I stood there, standing on my porch, waiting for anything to happen, but nothing did. I stood there, gripping my bat tightly, ready to swing at the next thing that moved. But after nothing happened, I walked back inside, breathing a heavy sigh of relief, and figuring maybe it was just all in my head. Maybe I was having a lucid nightmare. I went back and lay down, and that's when the scratching continued. But it was more faint, like it was muffled, kind of like the sound you hear when it happens behind a closed door. Muffled. And then I began hearing breathing noises. Heavy, raspy, heavy breathing. It would get louder and noisier, and then stop, and then resume again, starting off really quiet and crescendoing till it got really loud, and rinse and repeat all over again. Sometimes I would see lights flicker on and off all throughout the night. That entire night was a mix of emotions: scared, confused, exhausted. I just wanted it to end. The next morning, I want to say I at least got some sleep, but I can't be too sure. There were some things in the cabin that were broken. Shattered, actually. A couple of glasses that were left on the floor. It looked as if somebody had just shattered them, like somebody stepped on them or hit them with a hammer. But there were these weird scratch marks embedded into my countertops and the side doors. They were the size of handprints, and I wasn't sure if it was a good idea to call the police or not. Would they believe me? Would they even be of help, or would they suspect me on token on old Mary Jane? I had the realization here that I think my cabin is haunted, and even though I spend most Thanksgivings alone, this was one I certainly would not forget. You see, after this happened, I started sleeping with my door open, occasionally getting up in the middle of the night and opening the front door, just for my own security and my own assurance that nothing was out there. Nothing was going to come and harm me in my own cabin. The scratching continued, and even the breathing, but that eventually faded away. Nothing ever really happened after that, and I'm still convinced there is an evil spirit living in that cabin, and it certainly made itself known on that Thanksgiving night. I'm a park ranger, but first, here's a little more about me. My name is David. I'm 33 years old, and I love the outdoors. I've always loved being outside, especially in Yellowstone and the backcountry. A few months back, I decided to go on a 2-week trip into one of the more remote areas of the park. And this is where my story begins. I just finished setting up camp for the night, and I had heard something that made me freeze. It appeared like someone was whispering my name from a distance away, but was so faint it may have been simply blowing wind, playing with tree branches, or overactive imagination, causing hallucinations. But sometimes, your gut just tells you things you can't explain, and I knew whatever was out there was not anything good. Then, another sound caught my attention, an unnatural scream from deep within the forest surrounding me. I was startled. I knew that sound wasn't anything natural. The hairs on my neck stood up, and without wasting another second, I threw my tent open, grabbed all of my stuff, sprinting as fast as I could away from camp. After about 2 hours of running, with adrenaline pumping through my veins like a drug, I collapsed onto the ground, exhausted and out of breath. But at least whatever was behind me could not catch up now, or so I thought. That feeling you get when you wake up from a nightmare is what I now felt. Now, let me just say, I've heard mountain lions before. It's not funny. But this was not a normal mountain lion, at least one I've ever heard. The voice or scream that I heard had a deep, raspy quality to it. It was like the sound of somebody forcing their air to make it raspy, but also distorted. The same sound had no definitive location. It was as if I had heard it coming from both behind me and ahead of me at the same time. But it could possibly be somebody who is in need of help, and the sounds of the forest are just causing reverberation distortion. I couldn't just leave them there to fend for themselves, especially if it really was somebody. So, very quickly, I got up and acted, grabbing my stuff and heading in the direction that I heard the scream, even though my gut was screaming at me not to. It was not long before I caught sight of this campsite. Everything was torn apart. It looked like it had been ravaged by some wild animal, maybe wolves or something. All that remained were pieces of fabric, ripped edges, and some bloodstains. But then, I saw something that really freaked me out. Footprints, huge ones. Whatever had come to my campsite was big, about 8 feet tall if not more. It seemed to have 3 toes per foot, and its stride was incredibly long, almost 4 feet from one footprint to the next, which made anything smaller like my tiny prints seeming laughable in comparison. Then, I began to get this horrible feeling coming over me. I just knew this was a bad situation all around. I started to run off, but then I began to hear faint whispering my name, coming from deeper beyond the woods. The whispering seemed to be coming from all around me. I knew that whatever it was had come here. It was still out there with me. And the only thing I could do now was to keep going. So, I ran into a clearing about a mile or so away from my campsite, then stopped in my tracks to rest for a minute. I looked down at the ground beneath me. There were more tracks. I tried to leave as fast as I could. Although it was rough, I feel I was this close to being eaten by something that was most certainly not a bear, far more human than a bear could ever be. And let me tell you, if monsters in the woods really exist, I was about to cross paths with one. And fortunately for me, I made it safe out that night, and a little while later, I had got a chance to speak to my boss about my experience. Nothing really made sense about the whole situation, so there's my story. I'm still not sure what I encountered that night. The screaming, the prints, the abandoned campsite, all of it. Was I hallucinating? I'm not sure. What if what happened to me was real? And what if it isn't a question of if, but a question of when that happens again? I know very little about the paranormal or supernatural, but this event has definitely made me a believer. If whatever was out there with me still exists, then I hope it never comes back to do this, or worse, to anybody. God knows what it might have done to me, or the people in that campsite. My grandfather passed away many years ago, and so, not that long ago, my family and I got together on Thanksgiving and used a Ouija board to try and talk to him. Big mistake, right? Yeah, exactly. So keep in mind, this is going to be very long, so if you can bear with me, it'll be a little bit more manageable. Anyway, to set everything up for you, my grandfather was a great guy. He actually used to be a train conductor for quite some time before retiring, and then finally passed away in '92. He had a massive stroke or a heart attack. One of the two. I can never remember if the two coincide, but either way, he passed away. I was young at the time and don't have that many memories of him. Although, there are several pictures of him holding me as a baby and even a young child. So, I must have had some bonding experiences with him. My mother always told me he was very fond of me and my sisters. He was a very, very sweet, loving man, and having him pass was hard on the entire family. So when he did pass, it was devastating. In fact, my uncle, who is no longer here with us, ended up going on a drug binge, where his drug addiction would later have him claim his own life in 2002. But that's a different story for a much different time. Now, to bring you up a little more up to speed, this was Thanksgiving 2009, and I feel like as a family, we're all very on board spiritually and supernaturally. We believe spirits and ghosts and all that stuff. We were even all pretty open to the idea of using a Ouija board. Yeah, we knew the risks, but we were willing to deal with those risks to try and have conversation with our long-lost grandfather. And as a bonus, we might be able to talk to other dead relatives. Or so that was the plan. In hindsight, I don't recommend doing any of these things. So, Thanksgiving 2009 rolls around. We all show up. It's me, my mother, my brother, my two sisters, and two of my cousins. The entire dinner was spent talking about him and sharing memories and laughs of my grandfather. After dinner and delicious pie, we quickly clear the table, setting up the Ouija board, the planchette, lighting candles, and turning out all the lights. For some reason, doing this during late autumn really sets the tone and mood perfectly. So, we gathered around the table, put the planchette in the center, and began asking it questions. Asking if our grandfather Earl was there and that we could speak to him, or if there was anybody in the vicinity that could get a hold of him. We were shocked that we very soon got a reply. And looking back on things, I really wholeheartedly want to believe it was my grandfather. But I know it was probably just a demon disguising itself as him in hindsight. I first knew we had made contact with something or someone when the candles around the room began flickering. Like a breeze had somehow entered the kitchen, which would have been impossible. No windows or doors were ever open. Everything had been closed. And for the lights to all of a sudden start flickering, none of it really made sense. After I think question number 3 is when the planchette finally began moving. It started off with us getting some strange answers to our questions. We would ask, "Is this Earl, our grandfather?" To which the planchette would spell out maybe. What was strange is that we asked his birthday, and it spelled out DEC 14, 1938, which was Earl's actual birthday. So we kind of got half excited but also half scared that somebody or something on this board knew of him. We had also asked it his full name, which was Earl Dickinson Hartley, which it spelt out perfectly. But then it would keep giving us strange answers to things. For example, we asked him, or what we thought was him, if he remembers us, and it just spelt out murder, which we thought was very, very strange and very disturbing. And so then we thought, oh, did he somehow get murdered? Except we knew that he had a stroke, and that's why he died. But then my mother speculated in that moment, even though he died in the hospital, is it possible that one of the doctors or nurses murdered him? We'd asked the question to try and verify if this is true, and it spelt out, kill you. And through another series of questioning, we soon realized whoever or whatever we were talking to knew everything we wanted to know about my grandfather. but it most certainly was not my grandfather. Finally, we'd asked it, "To whom are we speaking to?" We got no answer. And then my mother asked it, "Spirit, what is your name?" To which the planchette spelt out, "Z-O, Z-O." And I thought to myself, Zozo? What is Zozo? And the second, in my mind, that I finished that thought, or question, the planchette, with all of our hands on it, immediately, faster than the speed of light, shot to goodbye, and all the candles in unison went out. Man, I tell you what, it was like a horror movie scene. All of us jumped up so quick to turn on the lights, and little did we know, we had somehow opened a portal with that board for that demon or entity to come through. Because very, very shortly after this event, things started to take a very, very nasty turn. About Christmas time, about a month later, there had already been all sorts of paranormal activity all around the house. Everything from creaking floorboards to hushed whispers, and the feeling like you're being watched. It was also right around this time as well that my mother really started complaining about acute back pain. It apparently came out of nowhere and got really bad. And upon going to the doctors, they told her it looked like she had some sort of severe spinal issue or spinal injury. But that was impossible. She had not fallen or done anything to hurt her back, other than maybe sleep on her side, but she had been doing that for years. But from what her doctor showed her, whatever happened to her spine was the equivalent of her falling on her back from about 12 feet up in the air. She had to have back surgery, and that put her out of work for at least, well, from what I remember, a good 6 months. Don't quote me on that, though. My timing could be very well off. One of my cousins, shortly after this, in the middle of January, passed away from a horrendous car accident. My sister, also around that same time, got a divorce, to whom her husband had become very abusive in the past couple months, nearly choking her out and trying to kill her on at least 4 separate occasions, all since Thanksgiving. This kind of thing was pretty common. Just stuff going awry and things going crazy. It felt like life was now off the hinges and everything was going haywire. And then finally, come August of the following year. So now about 9-10 plus months after the original Ouija board incident, my mother's house mysteriously caught fire and burned down. Fortunately for her, she was outside the house when this happened. But we both wholeheartedly believe that the spirit Zozo, or whatever entity it was fully responsible for all the things bad that had happened in these past 9 to 10 months. Considering we're a family that has pretty standard everyday luck. Sometimes good things happen, other times bad things happen. But ever since that incident, everybody in our family, or I should say, everybody who was attached to that board that night, has had a string of really, really bad luck, while some of us never made it out alive. Like my cousin who got into the car accident. I decided, out of desperation, to go see a demonologist, figuring they might have some answers. When I sat down with this man and explained to him what had happened to me and my entire family over the past 10-11 months. When I told him about the demon or entity named Zozo, his eyes went wide. And that's when he explained to me that Zozo is a very well-known, very powerful demon that's known for impersonating people, coming through the Ouija board portal and wreaking havoc on people's lives. It is a demon not to be trifled with, but instead of offering me any real help, he just kept pushing his pricing and services on me, which I refused to pay for. So I was pretty much on my own. After a while, my mother was living with us, and things seemed to be normal for the most part, at least until the following Thanksgiving. Now a year from the last one where we had the Ouija board incident. In the middle of Thanksgiving dinner, my mother dropped down on all fours and began growling, spitting out blood, acting like an animal. My family and I were so frightened by this, we weren't sure what to do, so we called 911 and explained our situation. The cops were able to restrain her and get her to calm down. But shortly thereafter, within 30 minutes, she or so what we were told, had a massive heart attack and died. Now, here's what's also crazy. My youngest sister, who's only 4 years younger than I, was having dinner at her boyfriend's house, about 2 hours away from where we were. FYI, she's also out of college at this point, and did not yet know about Mom dying. She too died that same night, by having a massive heart attack. But after that night, and all the trauma it produced, everything just seemed to stop altogether. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure if there's any real reasoning or logic behind it, but it just did. I'm beginning to suspect that the entity or demon named Zozo was truly behind everything, like a mad puppeteer pulling the strings to his sick orchestra, arranging for all these bad things to happen. Look, I've probably already written too much, and I apologize if this has become far too long to read. So I guess I should probably conclude things here and just say that if you're thinking about messing with the Ouija board, don't. Learn from my mistakes, because me and my entire family paid for it on Thanksgiving. I have a thing for going to look at areas with rumored sightings of cryptids. Call me kind of an amateur paranormal researcher. One of these places is a very small wooded area here in South Dakota. It backs up against a large high school. Almost all the stories out here about it come from construction workers from the nearby highway, or so I've heard. But every once in a while, I can find some fresh footprints in the snow when I go out there to check myself. There's something out here, I believe it. And this one afternoon, I was getting my daughter from work. Her building has a very large parking lot that I decided to use as a vantage point. As soon as I began reading on my phone, my neck prickled with an awareness that something had been watching me. To shake away the creepiness, I scanned the trees around me before turning around looking through my back window. What I saw shocked me. A dark figure, standing next to the trees, watching me. As soon as I looked at it, it dropped down and disappeared behind another car when it realized I could see it. It was ugly and almost kind of reminded me of a pig-like face. My heart began beating like crazy, and my breathing intensified. I watched the area around me for any more movement after getting out of my car before scurrying back inside to wait for my daughter. I finally saw it again when I got out of the car, moving to the back of my vehicle. That's when I bolted in after that. It was fast, too fast for anything human, but its face and body structure were very similar to that of a man. The last image I had of this figure was its dark shape, moving at a near impossible speed across the road in front of me, near my vehicle, before disappearing behind more trees. It freaked me out so much that after my daughter got in the car, I drove home with no plans of ever wanting to do any more cryptid research after this. Maybe next time I'll finally drop the courage to make it happen, but no promises. This happened right around Thanksgiving weekend, 2014. Years back, I was camping with my kids. It was late, and we were all getting settled in for the night, when one of them said they had heard something in the distance. We listened carefully, but didn't hear anything else. A few minutes later, there it is again, a strange sort of howling sound echoing through the trees. All four of us jumping to our feet and began looking around nervously. Then I saw it. The creature came out from behind a tree, roughly 30 yards away, standing there, huge body covered in dark fur, long black claws on its paws, like some kind of crazed animal. Only it was not an animal. It had these red eyes which glared right at me, as if trying to hypnotize me. Fortunately, I resisted any and all attempts for it to control my mind. I pointed my rifle at it and was about to fire when I heard a growl come right behind me that scared me. The creature's mate came up from behind and began growling while exposing her long yellow fangs. We slowly backed away as they both continued to approach us. We got far enough, made enough distance between ourselves and these things to run to the car. Even now, I think about it to this day, and I wonder why we were spared. They were nothing like what I would have expected, but that's what they were. Some sort of werewolf-looking creature. A man with a dog's head. Massive muscles bulging, but they were no taller than I. They were also wide and bulky. Not necessarily weightlifter bulky, but more like lean football player bulky. The hair on their body was short. It was almost more like a Rottweiler. Very short, but short enough you could see the muscle definition. And their eyes, the way they shined reminded me of that of a cat's eyes when caught in headlights. A flash almost reflecting off, except they glowed on their own. Whatever these beings were, they were a perfect blend of human and canine. Its arms and legs like that were shaped like a man's, but there was so much muscle definition, it was frightening. I felt more like I was watching something through one of those distorted mirrors at an amusement park. Running as fast as I could, we made it to the car. Everybody got in. A few seconds later, we heard yet another howl that chilled me to the bone. They were still out there, and they were not happy with us stilling their kill. We drove off into the night as fast as we could, but every shadow I saw that night looked like one of them. I've told this story several times now, but each time it feels more and more surreal to me, as if I were watching a movie or something. My findings have been incredibly disturbing and have been happening for the past 6 years. In recent years, since 2018, activity seems to have exponentially increased. We've been finding mutilated deer carcasses, severed animal heads, and other various gore on the far reaches of Yellowstone Park and surrounding areas. We're not sure if this is a person or persons doing such atrocious acts. We've noticed the frequency in which these incidents occur to be similar to that of a working job schedule, and therefore point towards a human being going out there to do work each night for this purpose. Very pattern-oriented. The mutilations seem to be extremely violent in nature, often sever limbs, other various things kept with them, including their bones. The majority of these animals have been found, deer mainly, essentially cut from the sternum, up through their ribs and spine all the way through their head from one side to another, bearing their insides on both sides of their body upon discovery. Oftentimes, we've found deer hung upside down from trees, hanging on high branches, sometimes 60 feet up on large pine trees. The strange thing is that they're almost surgically cut open, or it looks as if their wounds have been seared, like with a laser or something. We found one doe that was drained of all its blood and missing its insides, including the liver. The deer was also high up in a tree, hanging upside down when we found it. The oddest thing about this whole story is that it's been happening for years. Nobody wants to talk about it. And it's only in recent times that people are starting to take notice, after social media especially has becoming more increasingly popular. Only recently have I even seen information similar to my findings on various Facebook posts and commentaries of locals who've lived here their entire lives. Not in Yellowstone Park, but in the surrounding area. These tragedies do not just know the national park, but are happening all over the country, and people, believe me, are taking notice to this. The people of the Yellowstone area had believed that these mutilations were caused by aliens, or some other form of paranormal entities for quite some time now, but never had any real evidence to back up their claims, until more and more began taking notice due to more information being shared. Nowadays, my findings have been shared thousands of times across several social networking sites. I have no idea what's causing these animals to be killed in such horrific ways, or why this is being done, but I hope that somebody can find out soon. Until then, the park rangers will continue to do our best to discover more information on who or what it is doing this and put a stop to it. The animals deserve justice for all the lives they've lost at the hands of whoever or whatever is responsible. These are atrocious acts. However, There's speculation that it's possibly being done by a large alpha predator, such as a bear or maybe a wolf. The only problem with this theory is that these animals are in no way eaten on. It's almost always done in areas far from where the animal was killed. One doe we found sitting in front of her baby fawn when she was discovered dead. The doe had been gutted and left by the baby deer for perhaps hours to days before we found her. The fawn was also dead. We also found one male buck, missing his sexual organs, and another female deer inside of a field completely drained of all of her blood. No apparent outside wounds, cuts, or scratches on their body, except for one minor gash here and there, like they'd get stabbed by something. I would also like to note that neither of these animals have been found to show any signs of decay. This includes things like insects or signs of decay odor. It's as if they've all been killed and brought to the spot they were found in within a matter of hours. It doesn't make much sense. And the rangers here in Yellowstone have had reports from various visitors who claim to have seen or heard something while traveling along these areas, even more so late at night. These sightings include white, red, green, or purple lights floating through the sky, usually associated with the UFOs, according to several witnesses. Many people who live around this area believe that these UFOs are ultimately responsible for what we've been seeing each year, since first starting to notice it back in 2003. This is also near West Yellowstone, Montana, right outside the northern entrance into our national park here. I'm not sure how true this information really is, just from my findings. If anything, I hope somebody can find out soon and stop whatever's doing this to these animals. I don't want to see any more animals killed in such terrible ways again. If you've seen any strange lights floating through the sky at night over the past 10 years, or have an encounter with a cryptid here in Yellowstone Park, please share it with us by leaving a comment below, or sharing on your account if you have one. We would love to hear from other people who think they might have somehow come in contact with these beings and could help us solve the crime. We believe that there's something out there very nefarious, and we want to get to the bottom of it. So, there I was, just sitting on the back porch, smoking a cigar and relaxing. And then, out of nowhere, I hear this deep howl that starts near my house and proceeds to a couple of the houses down. It then starts going from backyard to backyard, and the neighbor's dog goes barking like crazy. One of my dogs hears them barking, jumps up on the fence line, and begins barking at something unseen. I get up to try and calm her down, but she won't come with me or listen to a word I have to say. It takes a few moments before she calms down enough for me to be able to drag her inside. It's then I realize there are these bright amber-colored eyes standing 6 feet above the ground, watching us. The noise, the howling starts up again, but this time, it's coming from behind my house in my neighbor's backyard. I decided to walk out there, and they start coming from the opposite direction, yet again. One is behind my house, and I could hear it walking around all over the place. Every time I try to find it, it's gone. It wasn't until later that night or early morning when I returned inside and heard another howling right outside my back door. When I looked out my kitchen window, this thing was standing at least 9 feet tall, with these incredibly sharp features, these ears on its head sticking up, kind of like knife blades, shoulders as wide as a linebacker, and claws bigger than any animal or wolf I could have ever imagined seeing. What happens next scared the crap out of me. This thing ducked down halfway and took 2 massive strides. This thing moved effortlessly on 2 legs, the same way a human being would. I remember everything happening in slow motion. My dog just whimpering at the window the whole time until it walks off, looks back with this look that said, "Come find me." I think it's because of this is why my dog will no longer go outside. He hasn't in 5 days, other than to go potty. He used to go outside all the time, but not anymore. It was like what she saw was so beyond her comprehension in her own way. Like in a weird roundabout way, using body language instead of actually speaking. If only I had taken a photo, I have no idea what this thing could have been or where it came from, but I have a hunch that it came from the woods out back. See, where my neighborhood is, me and my neighbors adjacent to my house are all backed up against a large section of national forest. I'm not 100% sure if it is national forest, but I know the woods go pretty far back. I'm a girl who has never had any real experiences with the paranormal until this Thanksgiving, 2013. At around 10 at night is when it happened. I was getting ready for bed when I heard scratching on my window. I thought it could be nothing. That was true. When I looked there was nothing. I then heard it again, but louder and closer. When I jumped up out of bed and walked to the window where I heard it, there was nothing there. The next room over, which was my sister's room, there were knocks on her window, and decided to go see what it was. Again, nothing there. But when I went in, I walked back to my room, and the banging continued. I finally got tired of it, grabbing my 9mm out of the drawer, still using my phone for a light. I walked to where I had heard the loud banging on the roof, but saw nothing. It was then that I decided that this is all pointless, and started to walk back inside, and that's when I heard footsteps, sounding like they were on the roof. I looked out, but nothing was there. I was confused. The next thing I know, all hell broke loose. Whatever it was jumped down, hitting my window, which made me jump back, startled. Then, everything went quiet for about 5 minutes, until it ran around my house, tearing up the walls on the outside. By now, all the dogs in my house were going crazy, barking like crazy. I ran towards the front door, not knowing what to expect or see when I would open it. I stood there, looking through the peephole, only seeing darkness. After a few moments of silence, whatever it was began banging on the house now. I stepped back, getting my 9mm ready. Then, out of nowhere, I hear a bloody scream, like a scream of pain, all around. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and then I hear another bang. The pit bull that I had was going absolutely crazy, barking at the back door, then running back by the front door, losing it. I thought we were under attack by a demon or something. Finally, I got sick of all this nonsense, opened my front door, aimed my handgun out into the darkness, expecting some sort of goblin face or something to appear that I could shoot at, but nothing happened. Everything just went quiet. I stepped out on the porch, expecting something to happen, anything, a noise, a sound, more scratching, banging, or being followed. But nothing. Everything was quiet, too quiet. It was eerie. The atmosphere was different. You could cut it with a knife. It was so unnerving. So in that moment, I decided I should probably just go sit back inside and wait for things to calm down. After going back inside, locking every door and window I had, and my sister was awake by this point, and she's scared out of her mind. There were no more sounds. It's almost like whatever was tormenting us had decided, for whatever reason, to stop, which, hey, I'm not going to argue against. But things were still very uneasy. Even my dogs kept whining and pacing back and forth, expecting something to happen at any given moment. The rest of the night remained pretty uneventful and calm. And once daylight finally broke, and I had not slept all night, I stepped outside, looking in the snow, where I saw these massive tracks that looked like something big and bipedal had jumped off of our roof. And there were tracks all around our house. Large tracks. They looked clawed, but I could not tell by the shape of the feet. Either way, I believe that demons can physically manifest, and that's what we encountered on that Thanksgiving night, all those years ago. I was walking through the swamps on my way to school. This is when I spotted something moving past one of the trees. I stopped and stared at the spot that I just saw movement, and suddenly, something emerged from behind the tree, taking a step towards me. It looked to be about 8 feet tall, long arms ending in large hands ending in sharp claws. Its mouth was huge, filled with razor-sharp teeth, and its eyes were a blood red. The creature feasted its eyes on me before looking away for only a second. It then took another step closer to me before turning to walk over to the river that was just beyond us. It then lifted its head, letting out a screeching sound that I thought and heard throughout the forest. I don't know how it happened, but when I came to, I was in my bed at home, and it was morning. Either it was all a nightmare, or it was the most vivid experience I've ever had in my life. The most vivid hallucination ever. I never went back into those swamps after what happened. However, when my friends asked me about the swamp trip again, for the umpteenth time today, I told them about what had happened in detail, far too vivid and realistic to be a nightmare. They were curious as to why we hadn't gone looking for whatever it was that made the screech. After telling them about what happened in detail, with the exception of the creature, they decided to go looking for themselves. I was only 8 years old when this happened, and I never saw or heard from those friends again. I don't know if they died or what, but I was told they had moved away. I know this is a short post, and I'm sorry for that, but I just felt like I needed to get this out there. I used to work in search and rescue, otherwise known as SAR, years ago. I noticed that your channel talks a lot about conspiratorial type of stuff, and figured you would find this information interesting. While I was not stationed or anything at one specific park, I oftentimes assisted in many of the Yellowstone National Park searches for missing persons. I'm here to tell you, many of the stuff you hear about is true. One of the gentlemen we found, who was around 24 years old, was the first body we had found. It was concluded that he was killed in a strange ritualistic killing. He had been gutted and hung to drain the blood. We found his body in an area that was somewhat secluded, but could still be seen by the road. I'm not sure how many people even go into this area, or even what's around, because it's located roughly 6 miles off a main highway. This area is thick with forest and large pine. I can't recall why his death was so weird compared to the others who were victims of grizzlies or other animals, but there were some oddities about this man's death. He had 2 puncture wounds on either side of his abdomen, one directly in the center right above where his appendix would be, as if he did not have them removed when he was younger. The other side was on the left, closer to his spleen. He also had a puncture wound directly in the center of where his heart is located. We were all confused as to how this puncture wound was done, because if he was hung upside down, wouldn't it make sense that there would be one on each side of his body? But he was also gutted and drained of blood. Another body we had found was around 2 months later. This was in July. It was an older lady, 58, if I'm remembering correctly. The woman was an avid hiker, and in the best shape of her life. She had a loving family, a very warm person. You know the type. When she had been reported missing, we did not find her until 3 days after. Her body wasn't laid out, but it was submerged in a small pond. We all had the same thought. How did nobody see her with all the water being searched by choppers going overhead? She too had puncture wounds on her chest and stomach, just like the man found 2 months prior. Her stomach had been torn open, and it appeared that she had bled to death from those wounds. Her body was later dumped in this pond. We also discovered a lot of hikers who went missing during this time during certain months, most of which occurred to go missing from January to May. There were also multiple cases where people somehow decided, hey, I'm going to go off trail today, and they get lost. Luckily for us, they usually find their way out within hours or possibly a day at most. But there were cases of people disappearing entirely. And when you do that, you're dead. I know there are rumors about what goes on in Yellowstone. The only one about disappearing, though, is truly real. You should look into it if you haven't already. It's not really something park rangers openly talk about, so I can understand if nobody knows much about it, other than locals and news who have heard stories passed down. Before this gets too long, I'll share one last bizarre account with you. This last one is actually the disappearance of an entire family. Mother, father, son, and daughter. Ages 35, 31, 17, and 14. While their bodies were never recovered, only pieces of the remains were eventually found miles from their original location of disappearance. A skull fragment was recovered in an area surrounded by empty cartridges. You can imagine what happened, but I'm not going to give you the conclusion because it's sickening. This family wanted to have a happy time at Yellowstone, so they loaded up their minivan and drove 6 hours from Arkansas. Sadly, they never made it back. As far as I know, nobody knows exactly what happened to them. It's just mere speculation. There were 4 of them, so it wasn't like somebody could have taken all of them without any others noticing. One thing is for sure, whatever did this got away with doing heinous acts committed upon this family. We still don't understand how this thing or person stays hidden when there are people out there looking. But if it is out there, we're not sure who could be next. No suspects have ever been found in any of the cases listed, but they are linked to other cult-style murders that occurred in the U.S. between July 2005 and August of 2012, all of which happened to occur within 300 miles of each other, most occurring in Colorado County, actually. The only link I can provide is this correlation that they all had puncture wounds on their bodies. This was about the last thing we found, but I'm scared people will think it's fake, so I'm hesitant to post this. You seem like a fairly trustworthy individual who has good intentions with what he does on YouTube. So, if you decide to post this, please make sure millions of people are aware of it, because there are some serious, strange things going on down here in the Wild West. I had a very creepy sighting. It was a couple of years ago. I walk my dog every night, close to the river, where it's safe and full of empty trails. Red River is a little county in Louisiana. Maybe you've heard of it before. This one particular night, I kept hearing shuffling on my left side, so I shine my light over there, but can't see anything, so I keep moving forward towards the river, which is about 50 yards away. The shuffling gets closer, and now it's coming up right next to me, on my right side. By now, I'm getting freaked out. I'm thinking if this thing makes another move, I'm going to be screwed. I know darn well this is not a person. It's far too ominous. And I realize it could either be a Bigfoot or a Dogman. I know. I've had encounters with them before. I know what it feels like when the atmosphere around you changes. I'm holding my dog tightly, gripping her, afraid she's going to try and attack whatever this thing is following us. And that's when I see it for the first time. Standing about 7 feet tall, with white hair all over its body, except for its chest, which had some sort of black on it. It looked like a pelt around its waist, grunting in the darkness. I've seen Dogmen multiple times, like I've already said. The first time, I was 11 years old, and there were about 5 or 6 of them running through the woods. I thought they were just normal dogs at first, but the closer you looked, the more they looked evil, more unlike any animal I've ever seen. Me and my dog ran, and the reason I bring this story up is because that's what this creature reminded me of. I don't think it was a Dogman, but it looked very, very similar. What are your thoughts on this? Okay, just a heads up. I apologize about the length in advance, but hear me out. I have a story that I've been meaning to share for a long time. It happened a little over a year ago, at a campsite in eastern Tennessee. It was just one of those times where you go camping with your friends and nothing really happens. One morning, my friend and I were at the campfire, drinking coffee, talking about what we had seen. He explained his encounter with the thing to me, as he called it. In short, he said that one morning, he was getting ready for breakfast and had heard something moving quietly around on the other side of his motorhome. When he walked over there, the noises had stopped. He was also on his own property and wasn't worried, but he said that the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. So, I told him about a couple of experiences that I had while camping there with several different girls I've dated in the past. The first one was when we were sitting around the fire at night, singing and talking to pass the time. At some point, we both got up to go into the motorhome to grab something. When we came out again, I noticed that all of our lanterns had somehow been turned off without us knowing. Not very spooky, but what really creeped me out is they were not turned back on for several hours after, even though nobody had touched them, because after I saw they were off, I went back outside, only later on to find them all turned on. There was also a night that we were all sitting around the fire again, only this time, my friend and his girlfriend weren't there. I was with a different set of friends, a couple whom had never been to this campsite before. We had been there for about an hour or so, between the 5 of us. One of the girls heard somebody say her name across the woods. She asked if anybody had called her name. We told her no. We could not figure out who it was or what it could have been. And it wasn't in any of our voices that she recognized. She said it was the voice of a man and had a very deep voice. I have another story that happened in Kentucky about 2 years ago. It's an encounter that my friend actually had, and it's different from all the rest. This one actually has witnesses corroborating what happened. The 4 of them, friends including myself, were camping out by a stream near Lob Lake Creek off of US 150 East around midnight or close to it, when we saw lights of some sort coming off the highway. At first, we thought it might be a car slowly coming down the road. It was after midnight after all, and nobody ever travels down there at that time unless they're lost. They watched it as it came closer, until it turned right into the woods about 400 feet from where they were sitting by their tents. With their curiosity aroused, they said, "Let's go see what's going on." And they both went, while the other 2 stayed back to hold down the fort. As my friend approached the area where he had seen the lights turn off, he saw what looked like 2 large dogs standing on their hind legs by a tree. He remembers saying something along the lines of, "What are you?" He just said these 2 figures stood there, looking in his direction. He says they're about 4 to 5 feet tall, and they had really long tails, and they were gray, with very pointed, elongated features. Their faces were terrifying looking. This is one of those stories that for me, to this day, I'm not sure if there's any real explaining it, or what it really could have been. I mean, there are so many things, but the lights coming off the road, and kind of almost levitating or floating into the forest, that was weird. It was almost UFO-like, if you understand. And the 2 small dogs, or as my friend calls them, goblins that looked like dogs. That's what really freaked him out. Why were they there? And what did they have to do with the lights? Could they have possibly been aliens that we saw? If anybody knows anything about this, please, we would love to hear your commentary or anything you might have to say or suggest on this story. I would like to share with you a series of events that happened to my family on Thanksgiving. It all began the day before, when my sister Lauren and I were in the kitchen getting ready for Thanksgiving dinner. While we were in there, we both had this feeling that somebody was watching us. We looked around but did not see anything out of the ordinary. Then it happened. We heard what sounded like a door opening from another room in the house, and then a sound of something heavy being dropped onto the floor. We both agreed that it was not coming from upstairs or downstairs. We could feel it through the ground under our feet. We waited about 5 minutes to see if it would happen again, but nothing ever did. The next day, Thanksgiving Day, I awoke at around 6 a.m. to feed our dogs. As soon as I stepped into the kitchen, my sister is already there, getting her morning coffee. She looks at me, asking me if I heard anything last night when we were in the kitchen, getting ready for dinner. My sister knew that something had happened. She wouldn't have asked if she didn't. I told her that I heard the same thing as she did. We both agreed it was probably just a mouse or something and laughed it off. But we knew it wasn't. We could have heard the sound through our feet, and not from upstairs or downstairs. Something was going on. and we were going to try to get to the bottom of it. As soon as my husband walks into the kitchen, grabs his coffee, my sister begins telling him about the sound from last night. Now, quick side note here. My husband is a huge skeptic when it comes to anything paranormal or supernatural, but he decided to humor us and say that it could have been Scott's grandfather, who at this point had passed away many, many moons ago, but he was apparently coming back as a spirit for Thanksgiving dinner. I knew what he was doing, trying to get us to laugh about it so we could forget about the sound. I just had a bad feeling that was not going to happen. We went on with our day. My husband was busy cleaning up the leaves in our backyard and getting all of his tools put away before dinner time. He ended up going into the front of the house. He could hear a strange noise coming from somewhere close by and wanted to see what it was. He walked around for about 10 minutes. It sounded like a droning noise or somebody kind of calling out his name. He couldn't find anyone or trace or source of the noise. So he went up into the house to grab his afternoon cup of coffee. As soon as he walks into the kitchen, I'm sitting at the table, still drinking on my morning cup, talking to Scott's mom. That entire dinner, just something felt so off, and we could not pinpoint what it was. My husband seemed very bothered by something. Later on after dinner that evening, he reported a strange ringing in his ears that got so bad he began vomiting up blood all over himself. We ended up taking him to the ER, but unfortunately, they did not find anything wrong with him. And for the next 2 weeks after this, he got very mysteriously sick. After multiple trips to the ER and multiple testing, there was nothing they could do for him. Luckily, he recovered by about mid-December and claims that the entire time he was deathly sick, he would have this same reoccurring nightmare of this dark, shadowy figure walking up to the house and going in and out of his own body, using him like a puppet. He would then go on to have nightmares of murdering people and being murdered himself. He believes it was total demonic possession, but I can't say for sure whether it was or wasn't. But I do know for a fact it was definitely supernatural in nature. First, a little bit about me. I've been working in Yellowstone for 8 years now, and with it, it's about to be 2015. It's going to be almost 9 years come March. While I've not experienced anything strange myself, at least too much out of the ordinary, several of the people whom I work with have. That's what I wanted to share with you all today. My friend and colleague, who we'll refer to as John, one evening spoke about a strange apparition he saw while working in the area. He was on the lookout for apparently reported poachers, and he noticed a strange light near one of the trees. At first, he thought nothing of it and continued his rounds throughout Yellowstone's main park portion. Later on that evening, however, he had returned from his watch to scan someone had broken into a nearby vehicle. However, before John could investigate, something appeared to stop him in his tracks. John reported seeing a strange figure dressed in all black coming towards him from behind a tree. Puzzled by this, John had looked around but found nobody else there, except for himself and the strange figure who came out of nowhere. As curious as to what it wanted with him, John had turned around only to find nothing at all. The next morning he returned to the area, only to find all doors of the car and the vehicle completely intact, whereas last night it had been smashed, windows shattered, and vandalized. He was beginning to think he was having hallucinations. As years went on, strange anecdotes began to pop up about this weird phenomena or presence reported in and around Yellowstone. There were reports of people hearing weird mechanical sounds like that of a steam train was approaching them from behind. And of course, when they would look, there was nothing. To see cars damaged with their windows smashed in for no reason, just after having driven past empty campgrounds for miles away from any human settlements. But then, when returning to the vehicle, nothing happening at all. This one, though, really stood out to me. I've heard many reports of people seeing that they went at the time to be children, running around with glowing eyes. Some even describe them as having long claws on their hands and feet, like some sort of monster out of a nightmare. Many people had reported stories about these strange entities, saying that if you ever encountered one, not to ever look them in the eyes at any cost, because if you do, it's all over for you. People who either never returned from their trip, or when they did return, became deranged by this encounter and were sent into a mental institution due to their inability or unwillingness to tell anybody exactly what happened during that night in Yellowstone. The same night, they saw these strange creatures running around. Another female colleague of mine, we'll refer to her as Rachel, has, on multiple occasions, claimed to have seen black-eyed children. Her first encounter with them was when she was on a hunt for a missing child. She had been called in as a part of her duty as a wildlife investigator regarding some mysterious sightings of aggressive wolves roaming the park, which, up until this day, remains unexplainable. While trying to trace down any leads about this animal sighting, Rachel had encountered something I'm sure many people would not be prepared for if they were to ever see it. As she entered into an area where she believed there might have at one point, or so, been some sort of small compound, or just inhabitants living in tents deep in the woods. Ruffians. Rachel saw what appeared to be a child running around. When she went to ask the child if he was all right, he appeared feral, hissed at her, and when he looked at her, it was revealed he had full black eyes and a mouthful of teeth that reminded her of an alligator. He jumped 20+ feet up into the air like something out of a paranormal movie and disappeared. She was so shocked by what had just happened, she immediately called her superiors to report the incident. This is one of the few encounters where a person had been brave enough to actually go public with it, at least public within her work environment, and, surprisingly, she's not ended up in an insane asylum for the rest of her life. Yet another friend of mine, Daniel, who has worked here the longest, claims to have seen a strange bioluminescent humanoid at nighttime. Back in 1995 to 1999, a large amount of these sightings had been taking place. His first account with this was on an expedition with a group of very good friends while they were all camping in Yellowstone. Around 3 or 4 in the morning, everybody was asleep while Daniel was on watch, when he saw what appeared to be 2 small figures almost floating through the air that were transparent. Daniel wanted to make sure this wasn't just the hour of tiredness playing with his eyes, decided he would try and make contact. As soon as he began speaking, before they even had time to turn around and answer, Daniel says he felt a warm feeling in his body, followed by a very strong surge of energy that went through him. He described the feeling like electricity, and then everything went black. The next thing he knew, he was awoke at 8 o'clock in the morning. Nothing had happened. Afterwards, he then complained of the searing pain in his side after that night. While many scans were done on him, nothing medically was wrong or evident, but the pain persisted for years afterwards. Another time while camping near Grand Prismatic Spring, Daniel saw what appeared to be a shape-shifting being. To quote Daniel exactly, "It was one of those really cold nights where you could see your breath condensating under the bright light of the moon. I was hunkered down between a rock and a shrub when I saw what looked like a cloaked figure making its way out of shadows, floating near the ground, casually walking through the spring. Daniel called for this being to come closer to him, thinking it was a person. But after taking 5 steps towards it, Daniel claims he heard a very low-pitched, inhuman voice say, 'Your death is soon.' And everything once again went black. When he awoke, everything was normal as before. No sign of anything odd happening, aside from the memory which plays vividly inside his mind constantly, rewinding itself over and over, like a bad song." In 1996, there was a massive increase in sightings reported by tourists and employees, all alike, reporting several different kinds of supernatural-like cases, all having to do with humanoid sightings. Some of these beings were covered in scales and reptilian-looking, while others were canid or ape-like in appearance, covered in hair. What is interesting about these sightings was that the majority of them were reported around the Grand Prismatic Spring and Norris Geyser Basin. In 1997, there was yet another increase in people reporting seeing humanoid beings coming out of the forested area at nighttime. Many employees who had been working for years in Yellowstone claim that they have never seen anything like this before, and it's really beginning to scare them due to the fact that they believe nothing is really being done about it. It's as if these things are watching us at times. I feel they won't let us leave the park until we figure out what is going on with their presence here. It's becoming more and more clear this is not just one thing, but many things, Daniel has told me. Within the next few years after these reports were made, there was almost no further activity, aside from minor things, like someone suddenly vanishing or dying of strange skin diseases. It was not until 1999 when several people came forward with their stories to be told. Richard, who also works at Yellowstone currently, a man I'm also friends with, where 3 times he has seen what appears to be a humanoid creature that looks as if it's paper thin. The only way he could describe it is that it was completely see-through, translucent, with 2 glowing eyes. Like it's 2-dimensional, he described it. And one night, during his shift, he was driving towards Midway Geyser Basin when out of nowhere, he sees this being standing in the middle of the path he was going to take. He, scared for his life, slams on his brakes, and this being starts coming toward him, as if it were going to run right through him. He says it's the scariest thing he has ever seen in his entire life, and after it had almost completely walked through him, he drove off as fast as possible. Now, according to Richard, when I had asked him about how this would affect me if I were to see these beings, he told me they would paralyze you from shock and what they looked like. But regardless of them looking horrible, they have not yet acted in violence. Yet. I have many more stories to share, but I'll end this post here for now. I'd love to know any thoughts or comments about these. There's too much of this going on from real credible people for all of this to have been faked. Long story short, I have a large portion of woods here that extends the far reaches of the back side of our property line. I've gone romping around in them woods many times. I love exploring. However, it wasn't until recently, actually, just back in September, that I realized something very evil lives within them. I could hear something moving around in there after dark, but never got a chance to see it until recently. I would always get this uneasy feeling when out there, and one night, while lying in bed and watching TV, I heard what sounded like a scream outside my house. It was so loud that I ran to the window and saw that it wasn't anything that I could visibly see. Needless to say, I did not get much sleep that night. Now, skip ahead to November 2nd. Me and my boyfriend are lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when we both hear this god-awful animal sound, coming from the same general direction as the other 2 times. At this point, me being pretty spooked by everything, said screw it. I'm not looking around in the woods right now to investigate. My mother raised me to be a strong woman, but every woman has her limits. I think I found mine in that moment. The scream, like the one I heard the first time, came barreling out of those woods. And not more than 10 minutes after, we hear footsteps running across the deck and out around my back door. This time, I knew I had heard it loud enough for this to be something real. My boyfriend and I just look at each other, and without saying a word, we both grab knives, or whatever else we can find as weapons, running near outside. We stood there on the deck, listening, watching for any noises. It was quiet out there. So quiet you could not hear a thing. Even the night was quiet. After standing there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for whatever was making those sounds to stop moving, we decided to head back inside, calling 911 instead of going off half asleep. Once the police arrived, we explained the situation, and they searched as well they could, but to no avail. They told us there was large dog prints all over the deck, but could not find anything else. It's now November 6th. I was sitting outside on my deck, and I heard those same loud crashing sounds again. And the screaming. It came from exactly where it had before, We decided that we would not be trapped in our house this time, though. So, my boyfriend got everyone together, like 8 people, and went out into those woods, looking for whatever made all those awful noises. As we're walking through, just a little ways in, we heard the most awful growl coming from my left. I look over to see what it came from, and that's when I see this big, black thing standing up on 2 legs, looking right at us. We all scatter like cockroaches when a light is turned on. I don't know what on God's green earth lives in those backwoods, but I have a feeling it is not there to make friends. Help me. What do I even do about this? It was a colder night, on an outdoor camping trip. I was walking around, playing flashlight tag with my friends when I heard a noise. I turned to see what it was, just as a white human-shaped creature walked right into my beam of flashlight. It had long arms and legs, with its head down. The head looked more cone-shaped and completely hairless, not at all like a Bigfoot's. I was so frightened that I ran back to where my friends and I were playing tag. I told them exactly what I saw. They laughed at me but humored me. We all went together to look for it, but never found it. The entire rest of the night, I was terrified, thinking this thing was going to reappear, grab me, and pull me off into the depths and darkness of the woods. My friends kept trying to reassure me everything was going to be okay, and nothing would happen. Well, in the middle of the night, I'm asleep in my tent, and my friends are asleep in their tents. That's when we're awakened by a crackling sound. I could see movement inside my friend's tent, which was on the other side of mine. I could not see what made the noise, but I could see movement at the opening of the tent. It looked like a huge head with black eyes, the same color as its body. I climbed to the entrance, shining a light on it. This creature turned, and I saw it. It looked similar to what I saw earlier, but it was a different creature. This thing had red eyes, unlike the black that I thought. Its face also looked different than the white creature I saw earlier. The face on this thing looked more ape-like, but it had pointy ears and very sharp teeth. Serrated, reminded me of a shark. It, just like the other thing, had long arms and hands that were full of sharp, nasty nails. The hair on its body was kind of greasy, matted, and unkempt. It hissed at me and scratched the ground before running off. We were all virtually pooping bricks by this point, and decided the best course of action to leave. We got up early, packed everything into the cars, left as soon as we could. I never went camping again there after that night, and then made it a personal policy to stay away from woods at all costs. The creature was lightning fast, though, moved with the grace of an NBA player during basketball. I've been uncovering more sightings in this area since many encounters. Some people know what dogmen are, but call them dog squatch. I guess because it's easier for them to say or spell. It's possible that that's what I saw, but I'm not too sure. I was cleaning up the living room and had just finished putting away the last dishes of Thanksgiving dinner when my brother came running in. "Hey, you two, we're going to play a game. You can watch if you want." I raised an eyebrow at him and turned and ran back out of the room. My parents were sitting across from each other reading their own books. He seemed excited about whatever game he was playing with his sister, which probably meant it would be a good one. Giving them a quick glance, I shrugged and followed my brother outside. "Dad," I called out as I walked up to him. "We're going to go play football. Do you want to come and watch?" He looked up from his book and smiled. "I would love to," he said as he got up from the chair and began walking towards me. I turned around and walked back inside. I heard him exclaim as we got closer to the door. My excitement faded when I saw my mom look up from her book, giving us a frozen stare. I felt my stomach drop as the words left her mouth. "I'm going to go lie down for a few moments," she had said in a shaky voice. She got up from her chair and began walking towards the hall that leads to one of the bedrooms. I couldn't stand there in silence. We walked over to the field behind the house. I was about to ask if she wanted to come watch when I heard a faint noise from inside the house. I glanced at my mother and then back towards the house, but she didn't seem to be reacting to anything, so I looked back at her and asked her what the clear noise was. She said it's nothing and began walking faster. At this point, she was acting very, very strange. I wanted to press her about the noise, but did not want us getting distracted from our walk, so I let it go, and we just continued to enjoy ourselves. As soon as we got back home, we saw my mother sitting in the chair reading her book. She looked up at us with a smile. "Football," I replied bluntly, after she had asked us what game we played. At this point, she was acting increasingly strange, saying weird things, doing weird things, and just acting out of the ordinary. At one point or another, I could have swore that I saw her eyes roll in the back of her head and come back black, like all black. No iris, nothing, but only for a second before she blinked and looked at me, smiling and saying, "What's wrong, honey?" She would also proceed to make strange comments about the house, talk about what's up in the attic, talk about strange noises, just weird stuff. After about a 45-minute game of football, my dad, my brother, and I all decided to come in and lay down on the couch. That turkey and mashed potatoes were now needing to digest properly, and I think we overdid it playing football. My mom would come out and say more weird stuff, even to the point where my dad would ask her, "Honey, are you feeling okay?" And she would just always respond with a resounding smile, turning and walking almost fidgetly back to the room, like she was a robot, very awkwardly moving. My dad was convinced she had taken some sort of medication or something. That was before she dropped on the floor, convulsing, eyes rolling in the back of her head, and coming back fully black. In that moment, we knew something was seriously wrong with her. But she wasn't behaving the way a typical person does when they have a stroke or have some sort of seizure. She was smiling, very creepily, and laughing, all in a voice that wasn't her own, while her eyes were stark black, like an 8-ball. I felt like we were reliving something from the Evil Dead movies. After a couple moments of this going on, we got her to calm down, and when she would close her eyes would go back to normal. That's when we really began hearing banging and loud crashing sounds in the attic. Somebody was up there. My dad demanded that we take care of our mother, put her in the bed, and maybe put her to bed for rest. My father was going to go inspect what was in the attic. He goes over to the hallway, pulls down the string. The ladder comes down. He grabs a large knife, grabs a flashlight, and slowly ascends the ladder. Step by step, he climbs. He gets to the point where now he can barely poke his head above the attic floor, and he's now scanning the entire surrounding. But he also hears pitter-pattering, like something running or moving. After shining the light, he doesn't really see much, but notices that a portion of the attic, one of the corners in which he's shining a light in, is so black that the light will not pierce through it, unlike the other portions of the attic which the light can clearly illuminate. He gets a really, really bad feeling. He immediately turns off the light, drops down the ladder, faster than I've ever seen the man move, and slams the attic shut. He's pale, and he looks right at me and my brother and tells us, "We need to call a priest." And I start looking back at my mom and back at him, saying, "What are you talking about? What's going on?" He tells me to shut up, and he does not want any arguments. Not now, not ever. He grabs the phone and begins dialing a number. I don't know who he's talking to or who he's calling, but he kind of steps out of the room. I could hear his conversation, but only ever so faintly. He's trying purposefully to keep his voice down, and he sounds very panicked and nervous in his tone of voice. I tried my best to eavesdrop while my brother carefully, very carefully, watched over our very sick and possessed mom. My dad walked into the kitchen while still on the phone and then sat outside, talking for quite a while with whoever this person was. I heard him hang up, and then, out of nowhere, He pulls out a cigarette and starts smoking. Quick side note here. My dad used to be a huge smoker for a long time, but gave it up about 7 or 8 years before this happened. He's only smoked a handful of times since then, and it's only when he's extremely stressed out. So I see him start shaking and lighting up a cigarette. I step out to ask him, "Dad, are you okay? Is Mom going to be okay?" And he doesn't really say anything. He's just staring off into the night while puffing on the cigarette. And without even making eye contact, just tells me, "A priest should be here within the hour. I need you right now to go spend the rest of the time with your mother until he comes." I knew not to ask my dad questions, so I closed the door and walked back to where my mother was, spending that time with her. Ultimately, unsure of what was going on, but I knew that was irrelevant at that point in time. I just needed to be with my mom. I think she had been sleeping this whole time, but I'm not sure. Either that or resting. Once the priest had shown up, there were some short pleasantries exchanged and some little bits of conversation that I missed. But once I went to shake his hand, he seemed very monotone. And in fact, there did not seem to be much conversation at all exchanged between my father and him. Almost like they knew what needed to be done. They talked outside for quite a while, before he came in and blessed the house. Then, he also went into my mom's room and spoke with her for a long time. The door was shut, and my brother and I were not allowed in. We had to sit back, pacing back and forth, wondering what was going on. At random points throughout the entire 45 plus minutes he was there, with the door closed, we could hear her at various points screaming and saying, "No, get out of me. You're not allowed here." And then hearing this maniacal laughter coming from a different voice within her that was not hers. At other random points, too, we would hear banging and crashing up in the attic, as if somebody dropped an entire stack of books over and over. To say my brother and I were petrified would be a massive understatement. But there was nothing we could do. We sat on the couch in the living room, talked about what we thought was going on, and gave much speculation to the whole idea of ghosts and my mom being possessed, which, by the way, we still believe, even all these years after. Maybe an hour, maybe a little more, the priest came out, with him and my father talking quietly. They said their goodbyes and the priest left. My father looked at me, then my brother, and kind of gave a kindful nod, and then looked down at the floor before saying, "Your mother's very sick. She needs as much rest as she can right now. I don't want you guys bothering her until I say so. Do you understand?" We nodded and agreed. He told us it was about time for bed. It was maybe 8:30 p.m. at this point, so we did our routine, brushed our teeth, got our pajamas on, and went and laid down. But as we're laying there in our bunk beds, we could hear something going on upstairs in the attic. Things were getting more crazy. At this point in the night, my father was already laying down with my mother, and their door was shut. I heard no sounds from my mom, but people were very much so in the attic, or so it sounded. It was creepy. It kept my brother and I up almost all night. We were scared to sleep. We didn't know what was going to go on. At several points, I could have sworn that I heard the attic door come down. But from my point of view where I'm at in my bed, I have full view and nothing ever came down. At least that I'm aware of. That night was easily the most terrifying. There were a couple times that I probably dozed off for short intermittent periods of time. And one point in the night, I woke up to my brother saying in his sleep, "It's in the house. It's in the house. It's in our room," which literally sent shivers down my entire body, and I had 2 comforters on me, as if I already wasn't cold enough. But what was even more strange is my parents' complete denial of any of this ever going on. As days would pass at this point, my father refused to talk about it or acknowledge any of the things that went on that Thanksgiving evening, and my mom just acted like everything was okay. She still said and did things that were out of character, but not to the extent that it was that Thanksgiving evening after dinner. We would also still hear noises in the attic that went on for quite a while. I want to say months if I'm remembering correctly. all the way up into the following summer or fall. Not as crazy as that night, but it's definitely interesting to think about. Also, I should include that this all happened on Thanksgiving of 1995. Now, my father passed away back in 2017, and shortly before he died, my brother and I finally got him to open up about it. And while he did not say much, he told me that he believes there were two demons in that house. One, which resided up in the attic, which is what he saw, hence the black shape or shadow that was covering part of the attic wall, and the other took possession of our mother. After a few months, he claims it got bored and left her body, but I don't know if that's how demons work. My mother passed away in 2019, only 2 years after my father. All of these experiences has left me with far more questions than any answers. For this story, we have to go back to the year 2015. We were camping up in Connecticut with my grandparents for a family vacation. We wanted to do something different than the typical camping trip, so we decided to go into some wooded areas. Imagine my surprise when I saw this creature for the first time. Before I get to that, things started off as normal. It was a beautiful day in June, and we were all very excited for a long weekend of camping. We drove up to the campgrounds and set everything up. Everything was going well. We started roasting marshmallows over the fire and laughing. The weather was perfect, and we even got to see a deer eat some food, right there, in front of us. It was amazing. However, nothing could have prepared myself or my family for what happened that day. After s'mores were over, everyone was pretty tired. My grandfather told me that I should get to bed early because there would be lots more activities the next day. I had no problem agreeing with him, and I quickly changed into my pajamas. I walked back to the tent that me and my mother would share. I was extremely tired, but not too tired to fall asleep. All of the little noises that you'll hear in the woods sometimes didn't faze me. Even though I was new to the sounds, they did not bother me like they should have. I had the comfort of my grandparents nearby, and I felt safe. The night itself was calm. I'll never forget the enjoyment that I found there. I quickly fell asleep. The next day, things were pretty normal until that afternoon. I got up and we chugged down hordes of coffee and ate a big breakfast. Eggs, hash browns, sausage, bacon, all wrapped together in a delicious burrito, cooked over the fire. It was exactly as delicious as you can imagine it. The first trail we went on did not show much signs of foot traffic, although I did see a very large spider. It was about the size of my thumb, but it wasn't hairy or brown. It was mostly black and had an orange stripe going down its back. I paused for a second to take a picture with my phone, and I went back to the group. We walked down that trail for about half an hour, and then we decided to head off onto another trail. Just as we were getting ready to walk into the woods, we all noticed a ton of broken branches on the trail. We looked at each other, not knowing what could have caused this breakage. The branches that were all broken from at least 6 feet up to around 10 feet up on the trees. My grandfather started to lead us off the trail into a small opening of trees. As we walked a little ways through, my uncle noticed something lying on the ground next to a tree. He brought it to my grandfather's attention, who then handed me his canteen so I could take a look for myself. What I saw was truly shocking and confusing. It was the head of a deer, or what was left of it. By the looks of it, the deer had been ripped off its body. It was just lying there on the ground. We all stood there in disbelief. I was about to ask my grandfather what he thought or speculated happened when I looked at the bottom of the tree that the head was resting under. The ground had been dug up, and around that area were large claw marks etched into the dirt. They were long scratches, almost like something slid along them with its claws out, leaving deep grooves in the dirt. My grandfather walked right up to the head, placing his hand over it, motioning for everybody to stop talking. He then let out a long whistle that startled me, but I could see why he did it. He was signaling us to be quiet. He had heard something in the quiet of the forest. Everything was still. In that moment, we could hear movement coming in our direction. We all look in unison, as we can now faintly make out a large shape, tall, big, coming in our direction. Superstitious about the area already, our group of 4 took off without taking too much time to take in its appearance. But as it approached closer, I could see it for what it was. It was walking on 2 thin hind legs, covered in shoulder-length black fur. It had a long snout and an unusually large mouth that seemed to be full of sharp teeth. That's not the only thing I remember about it. Its eyes sparkled like they were made from glass marbles. After taking off into the woods, I turned around one final time to see this creature staring at me. What happens next really scared me. I saw its mouth moving as if it were trying to speak. It made a grunt sound, echoing through the forest, followed by almost a whimper noise. Everything went dark, and when I finally came back to my senses, we were all in the car. My brother was driving us away. He told me he thought I fainted, but something tells me it may have been caused by what I just saw. It felt like I blacked out when I heard that low grunt coming from behind me. And when I came to, we were in the car on our way out. I do remember that we never went back to that location, ever again. Weird things have been going on here in Yellowstone. A hiker died here about 2 months back. We were called out to check out his campsite with the ranger that found him. It was not a bear attack. Nobody has seen anything like it before. It's like he was impaled, actually. And we got to talking to one of the people that had saw him before this happened. Here is their story. I was camping with my friends at Yellowstone National Park when I had heard a loud bang behind me. I turned around and saw nothing, but it sounded like wood striking wood. I continued doing whatever it was that I was doing, probably messing with the campfire, stoking it or putting more wood on. A couple of moments pass, and before I knew what had happened, my chest felt like it was on fire, and I fell unconscious. When I woke up again, there were 2 rangers standing over me, asking if I was okay. Apparently, a man close by, the one that I had told them about, had been impaled. I can't remember anything else about that night, except feeling like I too had something stabbed into my chest, although nothing. We didn't see anything unusual, but the neighbors next to me also talked about seeing a strange, dark, shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing while we were actually showing up to camp. They didn't say anything because they didn't want to spook us. The ranger said he had not seen anything, but stood by our story because he wasn't working that day, so there was no way he could have known about what had happened. It's a weird place, I'll tell you that much. Well, the very next day, we were going on a hike through one of the trails in Yellowstone, passed by some rangers who wanted to speak to us about the event. They said they needed our help because somebody had died the night before, only miles away from where our campsite was at. This was separate than the man who was impaled, but it sounded like something similar had happened nearby, and these rangers wanted to take us there to see if we had known anything about it. Anyway, that's their story. I'm a ranger, and my partner Sarah and I decided it would be best if we went to investigate ourselves into these things. We also got called out to an area because of a group of separate hikers said they saw something, and we wanted to check it out. The area that we went to was actually pretty close to where the other rangers were at. I think this is what freaked them out about us going there alone. When we got there, we found a different place than we had expected. Somebody must have started a fire, among other things. There was an old fire ring, and a strange pile of rocks stacked in the middle of this clearing. We also began feeling an ominous feeling, but we decided to push in farther. When I was patrolling the outskirts of Yellowstone National Park, something startling and unexplainable happened. My partner Sarah and I were walking through the dense forest when we heard a loud bang behind us. It sounded like a tree falling. We turned to see what was going on and saw nothing. So, as we continued walking, we could tell that something wasn't quite right. We kept getting these little bouts of immense dread, but could not pinpoint what it was we were feeling. Then, all of a sudden, we felt very warm, and the hairs on our necks standing up. Someone or something was watching us. We both spun around and, this time, could clearly identify two glowing red eyes staring at us from behind a bush about 10 feet away. The creature walked out from behind the bush, and I was able to see it in its entirety. This being had incredibly thick, dark hair all over its body, except for his face, which appeared human-like but more Neanderthal. He walked on two legs, just like that of a man, and the most striking feature of this humanoid was its incredible height and size, which easily reached above 8 feet. As I've stated, it looked more Neanderthal, with very similar bone structure and prominent brows. Its cheekbones were also very pronounced, and its eyes reminded me very much of an owl. It came towards us, and we quickly realized we had to get out of here. We ran back towards our vehicle, while we kept looking over our shoulder every step of the way. As we drove away, we could see the being now standing there at the edge of the clearing, still watching us as we had driven away. We got to the point where we could not see it anymore, but worried it was going to follow us. We were freaked out, and so much so, we kind of lost all sense of direction. We made it out and came back to the ranger station, where we told them our story, asked if anybody else had reported any strange sightings as of late. They said a group of hikers, like what I described to you in the beginning of the story, had seen a tall, dark creature roaming in the woods nearby. But this was about 2 months ago, and no reports were ever followed up with. They gave us directions back to the main road, where the sightings had apparently happened. Anyway, I'll never forget what happened in Yellowstone. What we saw. What was it? Could it possibly be the elusive Bigfoot? Or was this simply a figment of our imaginations? Are we even credible? I'm going to preface this and say that I'm not quite sure what I saw this day. Typically, I'm not a believer in Bigfoot and things like that, but this day certainly has me wondering. I took a solo camping trip to the northern wilderness area in California. I live about an hour south of Los Angeles, and occasionally get places by myself when my time allows for it. The place where I decided to camp was about 3 hours away from home. I decided to go on a weekend, and the weather was mild and overcast, perfect for camping conditions as far as I'm concerned. The first day of my trip, I set up camp toward the evening time, around 4 or 5. It wasn't until about 9 that night that things really got interesting. My campsite was, of course, in the woods. And there's a ridge that runs north to south behind where I pitched my tent and made camp. It's about 500 feet from this ridge to the spot where my small fire was set up. I had plenty of trees around me to provide cover from anything lurking in the forest beyond. As I lay there, smoking a joint to pass the time until bed, I heard what sounded like footsteps beyond my fire. I looked up, looked around, but did not see anybody or anything remotely suspicious. The sound continued on for about 3 minutes before finally stopping, so I decided it must have been an animal of some sort. I was just about to lay down and try to sleep when I heard it again, much closer. This time, the step sounded like it was right behind me. I looked over my shoulder and saw a tall figure standing there, silhouetted against my fire. My first instinct was fight or flight, but as I tried to turn around on my sleeping bag, I found myself paralyzed. I could move my head and nothing else. The figure stood there for a moment before walking over to the fire and kneeling down. The next thing I know, I wake up in a hospital bed with a sheet pulled over me. There was a nurse standing there, checking on me. She told me my vitals were good, asked me what happened. I told her the only thing I knew was that I had woken up here, not remembering how I got there or any of the events leading up to it. She sounded concerned at first, but became further interested in things as I explained them. I told her I had been camping and that I did not know what had happened. She left the room, and a man who walked in, who introduced himself as Dr. Keller, had entered the room. He pulled a chair over to my bedside. He asked me what I knew. I told him the same thing I just told the nurse. He was not dressed like a traditional doctor, more like somebody you'd see in the government. A suit, tie, glasses, that whole getup. He had asked me if anything unusual happened before this event, or if I was familiar with the area of where it occurred. I mentioned that there was a ridge behind my camp. Mr. Keller's interest grew more focused as he pushed his chair closer to my bedside and leaned in toward me to ask what else I knew about this ridge. He said he had never heard anybody ever going up there, and that it was too far out of the way to be worth the hike. I explained that I'd been on a hiking trip and had parked my car in a small clearing at the bottom of the hill. There used to be an old mining road there. The more I told him, the more visibly excited he became, and began telling me more about the history of this whole area. He started by explaining that this place used to be known as a very thriving mining community, but was shut down due to multiple disappearances and other strange paranormal-like events occurring in the hills close by. Most notably, there were reports of people wandering out of the forests or hills, usually naked and severely injured. Some were pretty far gone, to the point they died several hours after being taken in for care. They had no idea why or what was happening, but there were three things that seemed to be recurring in every single report. On several occasions, people had also been found to have no fingerprints. The second thing was a physical description of tall, hunched figures reported being seen on multiple locations, all during these disappearances. The third, well, the speculation was skinwalkers. He went on to explain that the Skinwalker Ranch, located in northern Utah, was not very active like it used to be. This hill, where I had been sleeping that night, however, supposedly contained an underground shrine of a skinwalker cult. Numerous disappearances and attacks had taken place in the vicinity of the hill, and many believed it to be the grounds for a skinwalker cult. My jaw hung open as he explained all of this to me. I asked if there were any accounts of anybody escaping one of these creatures, or reports from people who might have encountered their shrine before. That was when he told me about 3 missing children. He went on to explain that a mother had brought her 3 small boys hiking in this area. They were all never seen again. This happened back in the early 1980s. Nobody believed she really had lost them. They thought it was simply a mere excuse for them to leave their husband, who was a very abusive, mean, angry man. He told me to think about it, and if I remember anything else, to let him know. I considered the possibility of a skinwalker cult being in the area, but immediately I discounted it as a practical joke, or a sick ploy for attention towards the end of my conversation. This is also when he brought up the fact that there was military and alien technology being worked on underground, right in the same area that I was camping. His claim was that the figure I saw before losing consciousness used a special technology to knock me out. This being then supposedly carried me to the roadside, where somebody called an ambulance after finding me unresponsive. Listen, I get it. I'm still trying to wrap my entire head around the craziness of this whole story. I can't deny what I've experienced. I'm also not trying to profit off of this, and I'd like to keep my anonymity. So here it is. My account as best as I can recall. There was something out there in those hills, and it definitely wasn't human. Whether you believe me or not, please be cautious if you ever find yourself near these hills. I'm not sure if you're a believer in things like skinwalkers, but I'm here to tell you they are real. A few weeks back, I was on patrol with a fellow ranger of mine when we noticed an unusually high level of wildlife activity just going on outside Yellowstone. We approached the area as close as we could without being seen. We were able to take a closer look at what was happening. It looked as if there was some kind of cult happening just yards away from the park's borders. The gathering itself looked to have been small, but it had been going on for hours. As we continue on investigating and observing, we noticed blood sacrifices being made to what we assumed was some kind of skinwalker. We don't really know what they're capable of, exactly, but it's clear something is going on near the park, and we believe it has occultic ties. We decided to report this, but our up-aboves seemed very uninterested and unimpressed with what we had. It's as if we were expected to see these things happen. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that they've been happening for quite some time now. Nobody apparently wants to do anything about it. We rangers are supposed to be protectors of Yellowstone, and yet it's like we feel so powerless against the threats that are growing, right under our noses. So, here I am. I also know this isn't the first report we've had about this. In fact, back in 2001, a tourist by the name of Mary Gilbert was killed in her tent after she approached a skinwalker disguised as a deer, apparently. I've seen skinwalkers myself, although they can look different from what I assume are Native American descriptions. They have humanoid features, but are closer to being something straight out of your worst nightmares. Don't get me wrong, they could shapeshift, and you'll never know what they really look like. The only way to tell if it's an actual skinwalker is generally their eyes. Their eyes will look far more human than any animal you'll have known. I'm afraid for my life. These are very dangerous entities. They will stop at nothing to accomplish their goals, and they are capable of killing with the relative ease, and also love to kill. I can no longer ignore this issue, so I'm putting the burden on you, the reader. I want you to tell everyone that you know about this problem. Rangers need your help, if we are ever going to get rid of them once and for all. One last thing. If you've never seen of or heard of a skinwalker before, I suggest you read up on them. While they are primarily Navajo entities, their dark magic is known throughout the world. There's no telling what they might do if they come and try to kill you. I'm gonna flat out say that I experienced a Windigo, hands down. I didn't think they existed, but this experience has proven me wrong. I will never go back up to the mountains alone, or ever camp again. I live in Washington State. I have never seen a Windigo here, however, others have. It's usually up north where you'll see most sightings of them. Me and my buddies went camping on the powwow grounds at the Mystery Ranch location, right up near Mount Baker. We were drinking around the campfire with some friends that came to visit, when I decided to go back to our campsite alone. I got about 200 yards away from the fire ring when it happened. I had stepped over a fallen log, deep in the forest where no lights could be seen, just pitch blackness everywhere, except for the faint moonlight, which gave some illumination around us. I looked up and saw this thing. Now, my first instinct was to look away, because of how scary it looked. It had a human torso, was all black, like a shadow, very long arms and legs, but they were all out of proportion. It also had a deer's head, huge antlers that pointed down. It was hunched over, looking at me from above. Its eyes glowed yellow as I stared through the darkness at its face. My eyes aren't that great, so I couldn't make out details except for those horrific antlers and glowing yellow eyes staring straight into my soul, if you will. I was scared past belief, but something told me not to run. I felt like fleeing as fast as I could back to the fire, but my body was stuck, as if a strong magnet had pulled me towards this creature. I tried to run. I tried to scream for help. Nothing would work. It looked up at the sky and howled. Then it cocked its head over towards me and did it again. I was paralyzed by fear as I saw that face staring down at me with those glistening yellow eyes. It seemed like forever before it took off running into the night forest, making all sorts of noise. As it went through the trees and brush away from us, my friends must have heard, or something, because now they were coming straight for where I was standing still, frozen in fear and shock about what had just happened. They found me only minutes after it ran off. They thought I was playing a joke, asking why I would be out there. I couldn't respond. They assumed I was trying to prank them, until, only moments later, they heard the same howling that had startled me just moments before. They then realized right away that this wasn't some sort of joke or prank. My story doesn't end here. My friends told me to go back to camp because nothing would happen if I stayed with them. They didn't believe any of this happened. They would have to acknowledge this thing's existence then. It probably wasn't even real in their minds. Needless to say, I slept on the other side of our campsite all night long. No problems whatsoever. I ended up speaking to one of the elders who immediately noticed something was different about me. He informed me I needed to be cleansed and that I had been marked by an evil spirit. That's the sole purpose of what I saw. It wasn't there to cause me harm, so to speak. It was there to leave a mark on me, to invite more evil to come and destroy my life. He told me these beings, that's what they do. He never once referred to this entity as a Windigo. This is just my own speculation. I got blessed by the medicine man the next day, and things seem to be okay for the meantime. I still get haunted with vivid nightmares of these creatures. Very often, actually. The following account was given to Colorado curator T.E. Stein during a phone interview with Bob Jackson in 2003. Recently, Jackson gave permission to submit his account. Jackson, also known as Action Jackson, was legendary among park supporters, notorious among outfitters and scofflers. His enforcement of the park rules and regulations. He is retired since 2004. Few people have ever known Yellowstone's backcountry and its wildlife like Jackson did. The first time I heard anything was in the mid to late 70s. An outfitter and I were riding up to Fan Creek in the northwestern section of the park. Up the drainage and Stellaria Creek, we heard a sound that just kept going and going. It was probably a mile away. It filled the entire valley, kind of like 1,000 elk going to their death. I could not believe this thing had that much volume for that long of a period of time. He had never heard anything like it neither. A couple of weeks later, I was coming up from Sportsman Creek, taking a trail which comes out of Fan Creek. I was 11 miles back in, high up in subalpine fir meadow complex. I was on a steep side hill with horses and in woods, but down below, about 40 to 50 yards, there was kind of a fairly flat meadow with dense subalpine thickets. There were these low fir growths that have a centerpiece tree and then everything kind of cone shapes to the ground. They were about 20 yards wide or so. The horses were flaring their noses and snorting, like they do when a grizzly bear is really close. But I could see fairly good all around, and I could not see any signs of a grizzly bear. So I began looking down below me, and the horses were very agitated. They were wanting to get out. I held them, but only with effort. I looked down to see where Grizz was, and I saw a deer at the edge of the thicket. All at once, it bolted and started jarring ahead, perpendicular to me. Right then, coming out of the other side was this thing that was running on 2 feet. It was black like a bear, and it had long arms and ran. I think I held it there for 30 seconds, but it got scared and then came out. It ran, but not super fast. It ran to another thicket, and went at an angle out of the thicket to another thicket, about 50 yards away. At this point, the creature was 75 yards down slope. It kept hitting these thickets trying to get away from me. I've never seen a bear do that. They'll always take a straight line. The first thing I thought of was bear, but right away, I realized this bear was shaggy, and it was not a bear. It was also intelligent. I have never seen a single animal trying to pick up protection as it fled. I tied that together with the sound on the other side of the drainage. It wasn't that tall. It looked like it was maybe 6 foot, maybe 6'5". The side of the face looked like it had a lot of fur. Most of the time, it was angling away, so I only got a good look at the head for probably the first 10 steps. The proportions of the torso, it looked more stocky than anything else. I even noticed the arms swung more than a human's would, and it did not have elbows cocked. This is no hoax. I've ridden maybe 50,000 to 70,000 miles in the backcountry on horses, and you encounter a lot of bears when you do that. This thing, whatever it was, the horses looked straight down to it. One guy I met in the northeastern section of the park. He was camped illegally. He said he had heard a noise real close to him. I made him describe it. He said it was probably within 20 yards. One other outfitter heard that sound also. This would have been back in the early 80s for both of those. Another time, a crew examining the blister rust, a disease of white bark pine in the 1970s, came on an elk in the southeastern corner of the park. They came on a deboned elk and saw these real big footprints. They got kind of scared and headed out. On that same trip, they heard really weird noises up near Mountain Creek. One time, I was skiing into Heart Lake on the thoroughfare. We were maybe 5-6 miles east of the road, and myself and the others. All at once, we saw these footprints going across the trail. There was not any path, and nobody had used to ski that far in back then. These were real big footprints stretched out far apart. It was deep snow, but it was a fairly distinct track. That was the first and only track I've seen. In early to mid-80s, in the same drainage as Mountain Creek, we were just coming into Howell Creek Cabin near Eagle Creek Pass at 8,500 feet. We were coming in right before dark, and we heard that noise. I timed it at 26 seconds, about 300 to 400 yards beyond the cabin up the drainage. I checked the next day, could not find any footprints. Whatever that thing is, it doesn't let up to take a breath. It's like mechanical, rhythmical. I can't begin to describe it. It isn't like a mountain lion or a bear, and a bear can make some pretty weird noises. I heard no other reports of Bigfoot until 3 or 4 years ago. I was in Mountain Creek, and I heard this thing again. A district ranger once took sightings from a backpacker near Bella Lake that would have been in the 70s, west of the south entrance. Apparently, the person watched one on the other side of a small lake for 10 minutes. The ranger felt the witness was very sane. Now, let it be known that Jackson's crusades against the practice of creating salt licks to draw an elk for easy shots just outside the park's southeast boundary earned him lifelong enemies among local outfitters. He also campaigned against their habit of leaving large portions of the carcass behind. Meat that habituated grizzly bears learned to come running for the sound of gunshots. The bears that learned to scavenge the carcasses often got into confrontations with hunters and outfitters, leading to their deaths. During his career, Jackson spent a great deal of time in the park's most remote backcountry, including the thoroughfare, the place in the lower 48 states that lies furthest from a road. This is believed to be the first time Jackson has ever publicly talked about Sasquatch. If you have an encounter you would like to share with me personally, please send it to the email below at stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. I would love to read it to my fan base. Also, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe for more things paranormal, dark, cryptid, and monsters. This happened a long time ago, but after what I experienced, it will never be forgotten. It was the summer of 2012, and I was going through a paranormal obsession period. Me and my group of friends were doing an EVP session pretty deep into the woods. After a few hours, we began to head back to our cars because the sun was going down. When we got out of our cars, we were talking about how excited we were that we had actually gotten audio recordings of us yelling into the nothing. None of us could have guessed what would happen next. After a minute or two of chatting about how excited we were, something, at least we feel, began following us from behind the trees, as if it were stalking us behind those big oak trees. We all turned around and began walking towards our friend, who was standing right by his car. That's when we all heard a clicking noise. So, my friend asked me what it sounded like. I told him it sounded like something clicking. My other friends immediately got goosebumps, looking horrified. My friend, who had been standing there the entire time, walked over to her. She started shaking badly, told us that she felt someone or something grabbed her clothes from behind her, and that she felt a dark energy around us, that she no longer felt safe, and that something bad was going to happen. Later that night, I guess she would go on to have a premonition of her own death, but that's a different story. In this moment, she also mentioned that she heard somebody whispering into her ear, but did not tell us what they whispered to her. She could not repeat it word for word. Then, she rushed into my friend's car, who was parked next to hers, which made all of us relieved now that she was safe. We all got in our cars and began to leave. My friend, her mom, and I were the first to leave. We parked right next to each other. As soon as we got about 3 blocks down from where everything happened, my friend's mom said she felt this pressure on her chest, like there was something weighing there, like bricks. She couldn't figure out what it was. She was now having problems breathing, and almost collapsed. We then came up with a theory that it could have been an entity or a forced spirit guardian wanting us out of those woods as possible. So it was using spiritual forces or telekinesis against us. Just seconds after she mentioned this, I felt my phone ring. When I looked down at my phone, it showed these weird symbols above a number saying unknown number. And just for the record, in 2012, there wasn't near the amount of spam and robocalls as nowadays, and hardly if anybody even called me, let alone unknown numbers. The coincidental timing was just too much. I was freaked out, but decided to answer it anyway under pressure and curiosity. I picked up and said hello. All I heard on the other end was some weird noise, between static and a garbled voice. It almost sounded demonic. After about 30 seconds of me asking who was this, I hung up. I remember thinking how crazy this all felt, and nothing like this has ever happened to anybody. My mom was now freaking out. I didn't tell her anything, because she would even get more paranoid than she already is. She still doesn't know to this day that all this stuff happened like this. The next morning, after hearing everything that went down, we tried to research if there had been any sightings in the area of spirits, bigfoots, skinwalkers, but all we could find was that a few years ago, a few children were apparently gone missing, or even some found mauled by something suspiciously close to the time. I still have no idea if this is the work of a spirit, a demon, a dark entity, or possibly a skinwalker. I would love to know if there's anybody out there who thinks this incident is more than just supernatural, that maybe there's a dark force behind it, because honestly, I'm terrified to go back. I'll keep this very to the point. First off, a little bit about me. I have worked in law enforcement for well over 15 years now, so I know what a wild animal acts like when it comes to odd behaviors. I was on a hike about a month ago near the summit of Mount Evans in Clear Creek County, Colorado, at approximately 10,400 feet elevation. It started to get dark, and I decided to head back down the trail towards my vehicle. At the very base of the trail, I saw something moving across the path. It was moving quickly, and without fear of humans. I kept staring at it, as it went into some trees on the other side of the trail. It looked like a bipedal canine, very long strides while running. I saw its shoulder blades while it was running. This thing had to be at least 7 feet tall. I know the wildlife around here pretty well, and this was definitely not matching with any of them. It had been roughly 40 to 50 years since any Bigfoot sightings have been reported here in Colorado, at least to my knowledge. But after seeing what I saw, I'm going to start keeping my eyes peeled. Now, that was just my story. I have some good friends that have some pretty wild stories of their own, all seeing very similar things. In fact, a very good friend of mine, whom we've been friends for around 12 years now, he's an expert marksman, served in the military for a time, hunts, fishes, the whole gambit. He's as country as it gets. As we're talking about this subject, he told me of a situation that happened to him and his uncle one night, while out fishing. They were close to the river, when he turned around just in time to see the strange-looking animal moving quickly across the trail going into the tree line. He said it was tall, moved on two legs, and was not very bulky. It did not have a tail, as far as he could tell. His uncle had seen one too. He's much older now, but he still recalls the incident today, as it happened yesterday. One of my friends from work, she says she saw something a bit more aggressive than what I saw, but it still qualifies as a sighting. She was walking her dog one evening, behind the local school. There's a fairly large open field there, and she could see the school from where she was walking. As they got to the middle of the field, she noticed what appeared to be a large man-like figure standing just outside the school grounds. She said it appeared to have a human body, but it was standing straight up with its arms at its side. As soon as she caught sight of this thing, it took off, sprinting across the field in her direction. It ran on two legs. When she turned around and ran towards home, she could hear what sounded like footsteps following her. She said she could hear the grass and dirt getting pushed around while it ran after her. But at a distance, she's also used to living in town, and this scared the crap out of her. I'm hoping that maybe some of you had seen or experienced something like this yourselves, and can possibly offer some insight on this. I'm very interested in this subject, and hope to learn more about what it is that has been lurking around my neck of the woods. Thank you for taking the time to read this. Not my story, but a family member of mine who wishes to remain anonymous while sharing his Bigfoot sighting story with me. He still works as a ranger for the National Park of Yellowstone, but here's his story. I was driving home one night. It must have been around 10:30 or 10:45 p.m. I was driving down a long stretch of road, high grass on either side. This area of the park is more remote, but there are some tent sites scattered throughout here and there. My car hit a large bump in the road, which made me veer slightly to the left. When I looked straight ahead at that moment, I saw what I thought was a bear, sitting up on its hind legs, just staring at me within 20 feet of where my car had drifted towards. So, as any person would do, I tried to speed off out of there, because if you've ever seen what a grizzly bear can do to you, it's bad news. But for some reason, this thing didn't even flinch, and I lost control of my body. I decided to take a second look. My body involuntarily slowed down, and I feel like I rolled down the car window involuntarily as well. The thing never budged an inch, until my car got close enough. It started to rise up off the ground again, but at this point was now about 30 feet away from me. Its head must have been taller than my shoulders. All I could see was this massive, dark brown head staring back at me, with eyes that were completely red, and not like a deer or raccoon eyes, but almost human-like reflective red in color. The thing had intelligence in its eyes, and then it roared, which shook me to the bone. So, I drove off as fast as I could. When I got home, my father was asking me what took so long. It's not the first time that something like this has happened. Apparently, about 20 years ago, when he was still a ranger at Yellowstone, him and his partner were out patrolling at night, and they too saw an 8-foot-tall, what they thought was a brown bear, walking on its hind legs. Upon closer inspection, both men agreed it was not a bear. This thing looked just like the encounter I just shared with you. I'll never forget him saying, "They know we're always out here at night, and one day, some tourists are going to get eaten up if these things start to become more known." So that's his story. He told me that back then, and there was a lot of news about what people were seeing with this creature called Bigfoot. He thought something like that had happened to his own father. He's not sure what they saw, but both men agreed it was not human or any known animal at Yellowstone before tonight. Also, around the same time of his sighting, he told me too there were lots of strange lights in the sky and weird sounds. Other people, like campers and hikers alike, had reported seeing weird beings in the park. There's definitely something going on there. I guess about 10 miles down the road from his initial sighting, there's another ranger station, where about 20 years ago, back in the 70s, a ranger saw one of these creatures on the side of the road. His claim was that it was all covered in hair and walked upright, but also on its hind legs. Apparently, it was carrying a dead deer, with its neck broken. This man, my family described, had been a ranger for a long time, had never seen anything like it. He described the creature as very similar as the other two. He said it looked very familiar, almost like he had seen it before, except this being looked much more aggressive. People have also reported missing pets or livestock over the years, and not just in the national park, but in the surrounding area, which they also believe to be caused by something either supernatural or possibly by these creatures. I don't know if it's just my family telling stories, but after today, I'm starting to believe something strange is going on. I cannot say 100% conclusively that these things exist, but with so many reports over the years with what my family described, I'd say they're most certainly real. I've worked in Yellowstone for several years now, and it wasn't until more recently we've been having issues with these Dogman creatures. Campers have been complaining of the issue, and we're not allowed to say anything to anyone. Our supervisor wants to keep all of it super hush-hush. Well, I'm here to tell you they are very real, and I believe they have made a den deep within the confines of Yellowstone. This is my story that I'm sharing with you about my experience with these beings. Let me start off and say we've already received several complaints from campers who were in a specific region of the park. Things were escalating more and more, and campers had complained of seeing these canine creatures encroaching on their campsites, terrorizing campers. We were called within a Code 3, and we had to investigate the situation thoroughly. The day it happened, we were sent out to an area just northwest of Yellowstone Lake. It was off of Elephant Back Road, along the banks of the river at the edge of this vast lake. My partner and I went up to investigate and find out what was going on for sure when he got a call from our captain, saying there was apparently no need for us to investigate any further. It turns out some hunters may or may not have been hunting in that area and supposedly scare these creatures off. So basically, the first day, we did not end up finding anything, which wasn't shocking since I believe we'd have to take our searches even further. Now, the real experience occurred while another ranger and I were driving around in our truck, taking the long way back to the office after a routine patrol. We weren't trying to find anything per se. We just wanted to get back since there was nothing for us to do at that time. We had taken the East Fork Road down along Libby Creek until it intersects with one of the main highways out of there, which is Elephant Back Road. That's when he saw something big run up across the road ahead. We slowed down, drove closer, thinking maybe it was a grizzly bear, because they are known to be found in this area of Yellowstone, very close to people's campsites. We stopped about 30 feet away from where we saw what looked like giant dog prints in the dirt. The ground was still frozen, and we could clearly see 3 large bipedal canid prints. They were easily as large as a grizzly print. These things had to have been about 13 inches by 8 inches wide, and they had these deep toe impressions on the bottom too. That's what really made me and my partner and I look closer, because we weren't sure what we were seeing right away. They almost looked like bear tracks if you just glance at them, but you notice right away how much whiter than your average bear print they were, which led to me thinking it could not be a grizzly or a black bear. So we both just sat there for a minute, trying to wrap our minds around what we saw. He asks me to get out of the truck. I did, and he told me to check the other side of the road for any more prints. It wasn't until after I got back into the truck that my partner said, "We need to get out of here." I didn't know why, but if somebody has been working around Yellowstone Park long enough, you learn to trust them and what they say. So I did what he asked, without questioning. He began driving away, faster than normal, obviously spooked. When we reached this small roadside area where people would stop to see different sights along Elephant Back, that's when it happened. My partner slammed the brakes on our truck and just stared off into the distance. I asked him what was up. He tells me it's them. I could hear movement alongside my vehicle as I scanned my surroundings. This is when I saw several large bipedal figures that appeared blatantly canid. There were 3 of them, and they were moving tactfully. It appeared as if they were getting ready to flank us. They were coming at us from our right side. I reached for my gun, but before I could grab it, there was this giant bang that sounded like a gunshot and made me jump. I looked at my partner, only to see him looking behind us. So I turned around and saw this huge, the 4th one of the pack, breaking these massive branches as it forced its way out from the brush into the open. We needed to leave now. I knew it wasn't a bear. I knew these were giant canines. And also, this whole situation had changed my life forever. We put the pedal to the metal. I was in shock. My partner never said a word. Once we got back to the station, he went straight to his office, shutting the door. I knew he was never going to speak about this with anybody. We were told very early on to not make reports of this kind of stuff. In fact, things of this nature had their own category, but I'm already saying too much as it is. Now, for the record, this was my partner and I's very first experience with these things during the whole initial shock of all the werewolf talk among crew. Well, we would later learn some of us are very much so cryptozoology enthusiasts. We would be educated and learn that this is actually a dogman, and werewolves don't technically exist. Fast forward to about 6 months later. It's now later on in the fall, October, actually. The activity from these creatures had died down, and we decided against looking out for these creatures. People had stopped complaining and reporting the sightings. And like I said, there was really no more signs of them, at least in the adjacent areas. However, I had received word from my supervisor that the sightings were now starting back up, and we were beginning to have more missing hikers than usual. My supervisor believed it to be the work of these creatures, and desperately wanted me to go investigate to see if we could locate their den. I wasn't happy, but we did what we needed to do. We got an early start and making it to the trailhead by noon of the following day. It was our colleague's last day of work, so we had more than a few people with us. The rest were going to meet up with us later on that evening at our campsite, which happened to be on the Elephant Back Mountain where most of these sightings would take place. It was also this very same place that my partner and I had encountered them initially, only on the other side, across from where our campsite would be. We all knew not to get out of our vehicle while we were there. It's what they wanted after all, right? So we kept alert while we drove around in one of the backcountry sites. We had been tracking the pack's movement for some time, but could not locate their den appropriately. Since they were getting closer to the touristy area of the park, we needed to put an end to this. That night, we made plans for the next day to go around and try to chase them off. We woke up early in the morning, after barely any sleep at all that night, going back into the woods to look for those things. We believed we had located the source of their den after carefully going over some highly researched coordinates on the GPS. It was clear that something had been visiting this site very frequently. We believed it to be these creatures. We decided it would be best to camp around here at night and wait for them to return, so our plan was to ambush them and take them out. We went back to our vehicles and made sure we had enough supplies, plenty of weapons. We all met up on the Elephant Back Mountain and began setting up camp for the night. The sun had now set, and we all sat around the campfire as we talked about life and work stories. Out of nowhere, branches began snapping and breaking right near the vehicle. I ran over there immediately with my rifle drawn, only to find one of these things standing there by my vehicle. It looked pissed. Without hesitating, I took a shot, only to have it flinch and run off. I heard a rustling, so I thought it was safe to go check out on the situation. My partner went with me, and we found tracks all around our vehicle after this thing had fled. We decided that the two of us would take a position on the top of the ridge, while one stayed below near our vehicles. My assumption was they were trying to lure or possibly surprise us using one of their own as bait. After 20 minutes had passed, my partner still had not come back down yet. So I climbed down slowly, thinking I had missed something like they had ambushed him. But no, he wasn't there. He must have ran off into the forest after hearing gunfire. I began regretting this entire thing. Maybe this was all a huge mistake to pursue after all. I kept pushing onward, serious about defending our position. I radioed back to camp and told the others what was going on. I heard more rustling in the forest, but could not make out any distinctive sounds. The trees were far too thick for me to see anything from at the top of the ridge, so I took my chances and went down there instead. After about 20 minutes or so, the next thing that happened felt like a blur. Just an explosion of pain all over my body, and suddenly, I found myself being dragged through the woods, again, with these tight arms holding me. I was knocked nearly unconscious, and I knew it was these things. They were going to kill me. About another 30 minutes later, I regained consciousness, I believe, by one of my colleagues. I was beaten and scratched up pretty good. She said these things had dragged me through the forest, near where their den site was, and that we had apparently gotten too close. They were now getting aggressive because we figured out where they rested and where they lived. She saw them dragging my body, and after firing several rounds, they dropped me and fled off in the direction where she believes their den is at. We knew we could not risk anything else, so we went back towards the campsite at Elephant Back Mountain, radioing for help, so these things wouldn't finish us off. It was then that we were greeted with several military personnel pulling alongside a road. About 5 trucks in all lined up, men in black suits from an unidentified government branch, all jumping out with M4s to greet us. We were told to stay inside one of the vehicles, as they all began marching into the forest where we had just come from. This is when I finally saw these creatures for myself. Now, it was much more visible by the headlights of these military vehicles. Even though I only saw a faint glimpse here and there, they looked human, but not quite so. Far more human than what I had seen. Almost like a Neanderthal or a Homo erectus type being, but very canine-like. Shorter, but still bipedal, and resembling somewhat of a human. The last 2 times I had seen them, it was darker so I could not get every detail. But their intent was very hostile, as they kept pacing back and forth, and an eruption of fire broke out. After the men stormed through the woods after this thing, we didn't see anything else afterwards. These men also possessed very strange alien-like weaponry. I don't mean alien in a literal sense, I mean weaponry that's very foreign to what I've seen. Within minutes, we were quickly escorted back to the primary station and told to keep quiet. The military was taking care of the situation. My injuries were not too severe, and they healed in a matter of weeks. I'm still not allowed to go back out there since my superiors think this is all too traumatizing, and they have strict orders not to allow any of us to interfere with their ongoing investigation. I just want answers at this point. What are these things? Where do they come from? And why is the military apparently trying to cover up their existence? I have so many questions that desperately need answering. For now, though, I'll just recount my tales with these humanoid creatures, in hopes that somebody has any idea who or what they are, can give me something to know. I know I sound crazy writing this, but I feel it's important to get this off my chest. In 2017, I went on a vacation back to my hometown in the Catskills. I decided to hike part of the trail that I used to walk back in high school, back at a time that I was much more fit and in shape. This trail takes you through some woods, up a very steep hill. I know, in hindsight, it's 2020. So, it was around 6 p.m. when I began the hike. The sun had just set, and my phone on me. At around 6:30, I turned on the flashlight app for my phone to see during my hike up the hill. So, my goal was to make it through these woods before it got too dark. It would be safe after that point, since there are houses along the trail starting there out. Now, I was about halfway up the hill and I looked down at my phone. It was also getting dark enough now that I could make it through the woods with just the light. The sun had now just dipped below the tree line, so there were still patches of light shining through the trees. But as I looked back up ahead of me, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. It was just up ahead, just in the next patch of light. I saw what appeared to be a man's legs, standing motionless in the trail. And when I say motionless, he wasn't moving at all. That alone would have been enough for me to get out of there. But what really made me leave was the fact when I looked closer, it actually appeared to be a large dog, standing up on its back legs. When I looked closer, I noticed that it wasn't a dog at all. It had human hands. Now, I don't think you understand how creepy this was. What did I do? Well, I turned off my flashlight app, trying my best not to get its attention. I began slowly moving back in the direction I came from, praying to God I would not invoke the wrath of whatever this was. In my head at the time, I was convinced this was a flipping werewolf. This thing suddenly looks over in my direction, and I'm even more terrified than I was before. Its eyes were like that of glowing hot, fiery coals. I screamed, turned around, and ran up the rest of the hill as fast as I could. Once I got back to my car, I called 911. I told them what had happened, but they thought I was joking with them. What kind of person would call 911, waste your time and their time like this? They asked me questions that made it obvious they were humoring me and did not believe a word I was saying. The longer this went on, I just got angrier and angrier. How can they not believe me? I realized they were not going to help me in any way. I was petrified this thing was going to follow me home. So, I packed up my car, drove at breakneck speeds back home. When I got back home, I did not even leave the car for about 5 minutes, just sitting there. A complete nervous wreck, waiting to see if this thing had truly followed me home at all. After that night, I did not feel right for 2 weeks after, maybe 3. Horrible bouts of anxiety at random times. Always felt like I was never alone. This angst deep in my body. To say it was traumatic is treading lightly. I'm a man who loves to fish, and whenever I go fishing, I usually go looking for large ponds or lakes to fish in. One day, my friend and I drove out into the woods to go fishing. We found a pond. It was too small for fishing, so we continued on with our search. Eventually, we found a nice lake where we could fish. It was good-sized and lots of vegetation around it. Not so many houses in the area either. It was much more secluded, probably at least 2 miles into the woods. As we're walking around the shoreline of the lake, trying to find the best spot to fish, one of us feels something moving around. We both look at each other, assuming one of us had stepped on something, because the ground underneath us began to rumble. We looked in the water but didn't see anything, so we continued on our search for a good fishing spot, talking about how weird it was, and maybe we experienced a minor earthquake. As we're walking ahead, we continued on our search. I saw something moving just by the base of a tree nearby. It moved very quickly, but what I could tell, it was definitely not a human. It went up the side of the tree and almost hung on one of its branches by its arms. After seeing this, My friend and I were back to the car without looking back once to get out of there as fast as possible. And since then, I've tried to do as much research and gather as much knowledge as I can. And what I believe, or at least speculate, is that my friend and I saw a juvenile sasquatch watching us that day, perhaps out of curiosity. We never got the feeling it was malevolent or aggressive in any way, but more curious, like I said, and I think we spooked it. However, I cannot even begin to speculate about the weird vibrating or earthquake-like feeling in the earth underneath our feet. It makes me think of UFOs, which I have a lot of interest in alien stuff, and I've been seeing them all throughout my life. In fact, my earliest memory is very vivid and takes place when I was only 4 years old, living in the middle of nowhere from a very fairly wealthy family. This was also in British Columbia. I had wandered away from the house to play with another kid who lived about 150 feet up a hill next door. The other kid ended up going home for lunch or something, so it was just me alone outside, playing on a small grassy cliff above our driveway, which overlooked some forested valleys below. While I'm standing there, watching some ants, I noticed a buzzing sound in the woods, directly below me, behind my house. After looking around and trying to figure out where it was coming from, I figured possibly it was some sort of bee's nest or something living out there. I decided at 4 years old it would be fun to go check it out. So, I'm running back towards my house, jumping over a ditch that separated our property line with the forested valley. As soon as I clear the ditch, I stopped dead in my tracks and just stared at whatever it was, because you couldn't miss the thing. It was huge, almost gold and bronze colored, if I remember. About human height, maybe taller if not much actually taller than a single person. Anyway, within seconds of it seeing me, I hear my mom calling out from inside the house for me to come in, so I could eat. I start yelling back at her, saying I'm coming right away, and looking down the path towards our driveway, waiting for her to appear. After a few seconds of not seeing anything, and still staring directly into where this thing was, or is, I hear a distant rumble behind me that just seemed like maybe there was some sort of truck barreling down the road next to us, even though we lived way off any main roads, kind of in the middle of nowhere. Anyway, after looking back down the road for a few seconds, I hear my mom again calling out to me. At this point, I'm still just frozen there, watching and listening to what's going on in front of me, not sure what to do. Then, after another couple of seconds, everything suddenly vanishes. The buzzing becomes almost deafening, and a second later, a gigantic golden or bronze rod-shaped entity appeared from behind the tree line where this thing was standing, shoots straight up into the air at incredible speeds before disappearing. After regaining my senses from all this, I run as fast as I can towards the house, expecting my mom to be somewhere near. But instead, I find her inside, having never called me in the first place. I wasn't really sure what to do at this point, so I just stood there and waited for her to speak. After a few seconds, she asks what's wrong with me, because she can see that I'm visibly shaken. I tell her everything that has happened, and even though it's coming from a 4-year-old, she seemed to somewhat believe me. Although, I did not go into the buzzing part yet, because it's not that relevant. She does look confused and walks down to where the sound was, maybe about 30 seconds later returning, saying, "Oh, you were probably seeing people pulled down the road." This makes no sense at all. We lived way too far off any main road for anybody to see anything. The sound that I heard could have been the equivalent of a smaller helicopter. After all of this stopped happening, I thought it may have just been some hallucination, but the older I get and the more I read and study, I realize it was all too real, although I still don't know what happened or how to explain it. I was getting ready to go out on a date when my friend called and told me he saw something strange in the woods. This is in Louisiana, so werewolves and the rougarou have been talked about here for a while. But it's not often that you actually run into somebody who claims to have seen one. So, of course, I wanted to see it for myself. We took our bikes and headed out into the woods. That's near where we lived. It was foggy, and I did not feel right about it, but we kept going. The light from our bike lamps suddenly got blocked by something tall. My friend got freaked out and turned back, but he would tell me later that whatever it was had glowing red eyes. I kept going, not knowing what to do or where to go. It stood on two legs and was covered in dark brown fur, like the kind you would imagine a creature to have. Although I could not see its face, it did not move at all when I turned my bike light toward it. The worst thing about this creature was that it had paws similar to that of a dog, but much larger. In fact, they were more like hands, similar to that of a raccoon. They were also covered in hair and ending in long 3 to 4 inch claws. The arms were just as big, in fact, about as thick as the thickest part of my own thigh. When I turned back toward where I had come from, the light on my bike suddenly went dead. It was like the moment I turned away, my light would go dim and would flicker as if there was some electronical interference on my LED light. I panicked, turned around to head back, and that's when this thing began coming towards me from the swamps behind me. All that came into view were these 2 red eyes and a very dark space between 2 trees. That's when I saw a huge hand going back in the darkness, holding onto a tree. I pedaled as fast as I could, back to where I came from. I called my friend when I got back. He never made it home from the other side, but would later tell me he saw the same thing I did, and he refused to go near it. Now, it's been almost 20 years since this happened, and I still wonder what was following me that night. This was also during Black Friday, right after Thanksgiving, and me and my friends got together on Thanksgiving, since I don't see them often, which, again, is why we went exploring here in the swamps. Every Thanksgiving, it was kind of our ritual to get together, since they lived up north. Once they would come down, every Thanksgiving, while food was being prepped, we would spend it playing in the swamps. And then Black Friday, as our parents were out shopping and spending unnecessary godly amounts of money, this is when we would also spend our time in the swamps. And this is when this happened. Now, after this experience, the Thanksgivings after this weren't as enjoyable. We stayed out of the swamps and spent our time bored inside. It's a nightmare that I still have to think about. To keep this as short as I can, I was deer hunting in the New River Gorge in Fayetteville, West Virginia. This was 2007, the week of Thanksgiving. It was in the evening time, with about 2 hours of daylight left. I noticed movement about 60 yards towards the gorge from my position. I raised my gun to view the movement through the scope. After holding it in position for 10 seconds or so, I see a very large hand appear from side of the large poplar tree. It was palm against the tree, and I saw fingers mostly. Then, to my surprise, I see a head peek from around a tree, and 2 large eyes affixed on a head of a creature I've never ever seen before. I'm a hunter, have been since I was 8. I'm now 38 years old. This Bigfoot, or whatever it was, blinked twice while looking at me, then stepped back behind the tree. I viewed it for about 20 seconds while it was looking at me. My mind just could not figure out what it was that I was looking at. I knew what it wasn't. I had no desire to shoot it, and very well could have, but my mind and body almost seemed to be in a state of shock while viewing it through my scope. I had to cross near the location and trail, if out in the woods. I was terrified with my loaded deer rifle. My hair stood on end when I realized I would have gone towards the woods of the location to get out. I called my uncle as soon as I got to my Jeep, told him. He believed me. I'm a very honest man, and would never lie about this. The thing is, though, I never heard it run away or move through the trees. You could hear movement from 200 plus yards off in these woods. It's like it just disappeared. I came home very shaken from this experience. It changed my life forever, now that I know it's out there. It was very cool looking, about 7 feet tall. It had very dark, large pupils, and around the pupils, its eyes were very much like an owl. From the experience, its fur was also brownish blonde, and it had a very visible face. It almost reminded me of a face like a troll face that you used to put on the pencils as a kid, but it was very clean looking and not what you would expect. Its fingers were long and thick, with no fur. It had dark fingernails. I had my scope on 9 power, and it was the equivalent to being about 30 feet from me visually. It was real. I would take a polygraph and right now and swear on my life. Last year on Thanksgiving, my family was sitting around the dinner table. It was a great dinner, and I think everybody was feeling pretty good. My niece brought up the subject of past lives, which sparked some of us to start talking about it. My cousins said they've experienced past life memories while meditating, but nothing too deep or anything that was scary. Then, my dad also said he's explored the idea for a while. Nothing specific, though. My mom then mentioned that she had seen a ghost in her house when she moved in 25 years ago. Her new neighbors were over for dinner, and they had seen the same thing. This led to my mother telling us this story about moving into an empty house with her 3 daughters, and one weird neighbor telling him that the house was haunted. They had led to strange things happening that they could not figure out. The closet door would unlock and open itself. The things would go missing. Strange noises were heard in the middle of the night. After a few weeks, my mother decided to ask their neighbors who lived next door if they ever experienced anything strange, because she began to believe it was haunted. The neighbors had said they believed the ghost of his ex-girlfriend, since he used to live in the house with his girlfriend, came back, but she did not want anybody else living there. They thought that she had died in the house, but nobody could find her body. Her family even came to her house looking for her. The day my mom asked about the neighbor about his ex, she came up missing after all these strange things happening in the house. They never found any clues as to where she went, and they actually left the neighborhood because of it. Needless to say, my family is definitely not ghost hunting anytime soon, especially after the neighbors went disappearing. This happened back in 2003. It still deeply disturbs me. So, my mom, dad and brother and I are having Thanksgiving at my grandparents' house. My grandmother lives about an hour away from us, so we're driving out there for dinner. It's later in the evening, but still light outside when we get there. My grandmother has this big old country-style table that we all sit at. Even though most of us are adults now, parents included. But anyway, some people arrived ahead of us, so their plates are already on the table, filled with turkey, mashed potatoes, all sorts of delicious food. For some reason, I don't remember why. I'm not sure if my brother was sick or something, but my brother sits at a little table and chair, instead of one of the adult chairs. Anyway, my dad sits down, and he realizes that something is off. My grandmother had just stepped outside to smoke a cigarette, yet we just saw her in the kitchen. We all began looking around at each other, thinking we're crazy. And then we see her again coming down the hallway. All 3 times, she was wearing different colored shirts and pants with the same kitchen apron on. After she came out of the kitchen again, she was dressed in a different shirt. We had all looked at each other, asking her if she felt okay. Now, to preface this, I want to say it is impossible for her to move around the house this quickly without any of us ever seeing it. There is no way that my 65-year-old grandmother can move all the way back to her back bedroom, change pants and shirt that quickly, without us ever seeing it. It didn't make sense. Either this is a glitch in the Matrix, or she is a doppelganger, or it was the most convincing prank she has ever pulled. I live in Indiana, and I've seen a humanoid form late at night in the woods near my house. It was an entire humanoid figure standing on 2 legs. It looked like it had long hair and was very tall when I saw it from afar. So my family and I saw it from afar as well. It was standing near the tree line, looking at us. but no discernible features like eyes or mouth. Just a dark human-shaped form. We thought it might be fake or possibly somebody pranking us. We did not want to investigate further than that, even though deep down, we all believed it was something dark. So, we were now in our backyard, with a bunch of other people. We're all sitting down, looking at the stars, and we spotted it again, standing in the trees with the help of my telescope, which means that this thing was tall enough to stand out against the tree line, or at least stood out enough. This is not something you can get confused with an ape or anything else. It looked very human-like. After that, I kind of forgot about it until many years later, when I began reading about other sightings and how people see similar things, like Bigfoot, Dogman, or other creatures. I also saw something like this when I was in high school. It wasn't near my home, but more when I lived up north in Michigan. It happened when we were driving back from Ohio one night. We saw what looked like two very tall figures jumping near the back of a truck. They had these massive gaping mouths that were full of teeth, and they stood roughly 4 to 5 feet tall. I remember it was also right around midnight, too, when we saw them, and they had just ran out of a large field. I did not see their faces clearly enough, but they had long shaggy hair, and the mouths were the thing that stuck out to me the most. One was standing on each side of the open bed of the truck, and they were also kind of hunched over. They seemed to be watching the cars pass by. I couldn't tell you if they were canine or like, but they were furry humanoid-looking creatures. Terrifying. In 2007, I was traveling to the family home in the mountains to spend Thanksgiving with my family. My mom and I were driving, and she was swerving down the mountain like she always does. She's a very dangerous driver, let me tell you. We hit this patch of black ice in the area where there had been no weather reports indicating any possibility of it forming. We spun out of control on this road that is mostly straight, but has a couple of curves along the way. As we're spinning, things start flying past our windows so quickly, but at the same time so slow. I couldn't make heads or tails of what was happening until everything stopped moving, and I realized all 3 of our tires on our car had blown out. There was smoke everywhere, from each tire deflating and burning rubber permeated the air. My mom and I had 40 minutes to get our butts out of Dodge before we had completely slid down an embankment with no way to get back up. It's a 2-lane country road. We were very fortunate that we even got cell service. As we sat there, waiting for the tow truck to come and take us to my uncle's house, which is where we were heading initially, we felt like we were being watched by something. I know, that sounds pretty far-fetched, but it's just a feeling that I felt off in the woods, and I'm not sure what it was, or what could have made it, but something was there. We could feel a disturbance. We felt incredibly uneasy the entire time we're waiting for this tow truck. Finally, when it shows up, even the tow truck driver kind of noticed it. He didn't say anything, but he was looking around and acting very strange, like he just wanted to get out of there and get the job done. He was working faster than usual. While we were in the truck with him, he mentioned if we saw what he did, and he went to tell us that he saw a large figure staring at us through the trees, but he assumed it was a large man trying to mug us. There really wasn't much said about it other than that. I can't help but wonder if our experience was actually something else, that it was not a man, but something supernatural. This time of year, things can be rough for a lot of people. I'm usually a hermit kind of person, and I choose to spend my time alone. I've been that way for as long as I can remember. This particular year was no different for me. I live by myself. On Thanksgiving, I drove back to my house. It was foggy, so when I got to the driveway, I saw what appeared to be like 2 sets of eyes running from the woodline right near my house. I stepped out of my car, walking down the driveway to see if it was somebody there. I had a Bowie knife strapped to my thigh, and I carry a 9mm with me too. I was packing and was not afraid to use lethal force if I needed it. There were some trees by a small hill next to my house. These eyes were almost resting there on top of it, and suddenly, I see this figure come from behind one of the trees and is kind of moving around, like it was not wanting to be seen. That's when I realized it was much larger than a person. It was huge. Everything around it began shaking as this being or person or thing began moving quickly, almost hitting the trees. After seeing this, I went inside quickly, called my uncle, and described what happened to him. He's a very experienced hunter, far more than I am. He said that it was probably what they call a dogman. I never heard of that before. I actually had to get online and research what it could have been. This is the most significant and lasting effect this sighting has had on my life. It's the realization that there are things in this world we cannot explain. The idea of a dogman may seem absurd to some, but after my experience, I'm not so sure anymore. The events of that Thanksgiving Day have given me a new perspective on the paranormal, and it's opened up a whole new adventure of exploration for me. Cryptozoology was always interesting, but just pseudoscience. But now, I believe it's more real than ever, and there could possibly be other creatures out there that are werewolf-like.